Certain discoveries refuse every logical conclusion, leaving only fragments of evidence and unsettling silence. Ancient monuments, sealed chambers, unexplained disappearances, and cryptic artifacts continue to resist even the most determined investigations. Each mystery reveals another crack in humanity's understanding of the past, where certainty gives way to unease. So settle in, keep an open mind, and let's uncover 15 terrifying historical mysteries that continue to baffle researchers. Far beyond the familiar trade routes of the medieval Islamic world, where the horizon dissolved into endless ocean and the maps of scholars faded into uncertainty, there existed a place that inspired equal measures of fascination and doubt. It appeared in old Arabic writings under a single enigmatic name, Waqwaq. Some described it as a chain of prosperous islands overflowing with gold, rare woods, fragrant spices, and remarkable wealth. Others portrayed it as a realm so distant that reaching it demanded months of sailing through unpredictable seas where even experienced navigators hesitated to venture. The farther the stories traveled, the more elusive Waqwaq became. During the height of the Abbasid Caliphate, Baghdad stood at the center of one of the greatest intellectual and commercial networks of the medieval world. Merchants exchanged silk from China, ivory from East Africa, and precious metals from distant kingdoms. Geographers gathered reports from sailors, travelers, and diplomats, attempting to assemble a picture of lands that few had ever witnessed. Yet among all the destinations recorded in their manuscripts, Waqwaq occupied a category of its own. Classical Arabic authors, including renowned geographers, referred to Waqwaq as though it existed beyond the known maritime frontier. While descriptions differed, many accounts agreed that it lay somewhere far to the east, beyond established shipping lanes. The islands supposedly possessed abundant natural resources, particularly gold so plentiful that it seemed almost ordinary. Exotic animals, unusual plants, and unfamiliar customs only deepened the fascination surrounding the region. Some historians believe these descriptions reflected distant knowledge of Southeast Asia, perhaps Indonesia or nearby island groups. Others suggest the stories may have drawn inspiration from Japan, whose immense distance from the Abbasid world allowed imagination to fill countless gaps. Medieval sailors often passed information from one port to another, and every retelling introduced subtle changes. Facts blended with misunderstandings until geography and folklore became nearly impossible to separate. Within this atmosphere of curiosity, several later traditions describe an ambitious Abbasid expedition organized to reach the legendary islands directly. According to these accounts, ships departed with experienced sailors, merchants, interpreters, and valuable trade goods, hoping to establish contact with lands that promised unimaginable riches. It would have been an undertaking worthy of the Caliphate's confidence, reflecting an era when exploration expanded alongside commerce and scholarship. Then, according to the tradition, silence followed. No celebrated homecoming entered the historical record. No detailed travel account survived to describe the voyage's final destination. The expedition appeared to dissolve into the immense expanse of the eastern seas, leaving behind little more than scattered references and centuries of speculation. Was the fleet overwhelmed by violent storms that routinely swept the Indian Ocean and surrounding waters? Medieval vessels, despite impressive craftsmanship, remained vulnerable to changing weather, hidden reefs, and powerful currents capable of scattering even well-prepared convoys. Another possibility is far less dramatic but equally plausible. Perhaps the expedition never existed as a single organized mission at all. Some modern researchers argue that later writers may have combined several independent merchant voyages into one compelling narrative. Over generations, isolated disappearances, interrupted trade missions, and fragmentary reports could easily merge into the legend of a single fleet that never returned. Yet the mystery continues to invite broader interpretations. Certain researchers point toward the remarkable complexity of maritime navigation during the 9th and 10th centuries. Accurate longitude remained impossible to determine at sea, while cloud cover could obscure celestial navigation for days. A fleet venturing beyond familiar routes might have drifted hundreds of miles off course without realizing it. Could the expedition have reached another coastline entirely, becoming absorbed into distant communities whose surviving records described unfamiliar visitors without identifying their origins? Other theories focus on Waqwaq itself. Medieval descriptions vary so dramatically that some scholars question whether the name referred to one location at all. It may have represented several island chains linked together through commerce, with sailors applying the same name to multiple destinations separated by vast distances. If so, an expedition searching for a single kingdom would have pursued a place that existed only within the overlapping memories of countless travelers. There are also traditions far removed from conventional historical analysis. Certain medieval tales describe Waqwaq as a realm where nature behaved in astonishing ways, where unfamiliar trees produced eerie sounds carried by the wind, and where landscapes appeared unlike anything known elsewhere. Such accounts were never presented as scientific observations, yet they survived because they captured the imagination of generations. Were these poetic embellishments inspired by unfamiliar tropical environments, or echoes of stories transformed through centuries of oral transmission? Archaeology has offered only limited assistance. Ancient shipwrecks continue to emerge from the Indian Ocean and Southeast Asian waters, revealing forgotten trade networks that once connected civilizations separated by thousands of miles. Each discovery demonstrates that medieval sailors traveled farther than earlier generations believed. Even so, no confirmed evidence has identified the expedition described in later traditions or established the precise location of Waqwaq itself. Perhaps that uncertainty explains why the story has endured. It occupies a rare space where documented geography, commercial ambition, maritime history, and enduring legend intersect. Every surviving manuscript preserves another fragment, yet none completes the picture. Somewhere beyond the certainty of established records, the fate of the Abbasid expedition remains suspended between historical possibility and enduring mystery, leaving open the quiet possibility that its final destination has yet to be recognized. If the unanswered fate of the expedition to Waqwaq reminds us how easily an entire voyage can disappear beyond the edge of reliable records, the next mystery shifts our attention from the open sea to the vast interior of Asia. Here, there were no endless waves or distant islands, only an immense landscape of mountains, deserts, fertile valleys, and caravan roads that carried the wealth of empires. Yet even along these well-traveled routes, people, fortunes, and entire stories could simply fade from view. Morning light stretches across the plains of Khurasan, illuminating ancient roads worn smooth by countless caravans. Dust rises beneath the feet of camels, while distant mountain ranges stand motionless against a pale horizon. For centuries, this region connected Baghdad with Central Asia, Persia, and the thriving commercial centers farther east. Merchants transported silk, spices, manuscripts, precious metals, and carefully minted coins through a network that formed one of the economic lifelines of the Abbasid Caliphate. Khurasan was more than a province. It was a crossroads where cultures, languages, religions, and political ambitions met. Whoever controlled these routes possessed access to immense wealth, but they also inherited considerable risks. Harsh winters, sudden sandstorms, tribal conflicts, and organized banditry all threatened the steady movement of commerce across the region. Among the many stories preserved in regional traditions is the account of a remarkably valuable silver caravan that reportedly departed under Abbasid authority. According to later narratives, the convoy carried an extraordinary quantity of silver intended for official payments, military expenses, or perhaps commercial exchange in the eastern territories. Pack animals laden with carefully sealed cargo were accompanied by experienced guards familiar with the demanding terrain. Then the caravan entered Khurasan. After that point, the trail grows unexpectedly faint. Unlike ordinary merchant groups, a government-sponsored convoy carrying significant wealth would likely have generated administrative records at multiple destinations. Such shipments were important to taxation, military logistics, and regional governance. Yet no surviving document clearly records the successful arrival of the caravan described in later accounts. Instead, scattered references hint that it disappeared somewhere along its intended route, leaving behind uncertainty rather than resolution. The most practical explanation remains the simplest. Medieval caravan travel was never entirely secure. Even large escorts could become vulnerable while crossing isolated mountain passes or narrow valleys where attackers possessed the advantage of surprise. Organized raiding groups occasionally targeted valuable cargo, striking quickly before dispersing into terrain that made pursuit nearly impossible. Could the silver have been seized, melted down, and gradually absorbed into local economies without leaving recognizable traces? Nature presents another possibility. Khurasan's environment could change dramatically within hours. Flash floods swept through normally dry riverbeds, while earthquakes periodically reshaped sections of the landscape. Landslides buried roads beneath tons of rock and earth, erasing visible evidence of travelers who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. If such an event overtook the caravan, centuries of erosion might have concealed every remaining clue beneath layers of sediment. Some historians approach the mystery from a different direction. Rather than assuming a catastrophic disappearance, they suggest that confusion within surviving records may have transformed an ordinary financial loss into an enduring legend. Medieval archives are incomplete, and many administrative documents have not survived the passage of time. A delayed shipment, an accounting error, or political upheaval could eventually evolve into the tale of a missing fortune once precise records were forgotten. Political instability also deserves careful consideration. During various periods of Abbasid rule, regional governors competed for influence, military commanders exercised considerable independence, and local alliances shifted rapidly. Could officials have diverted the silver intentionally during a moment of internal conflict? If so, silence may have served everyone's interests, allowing responsibility to disappear alongside the treasure itself. Yet speculation extends further. Some regional folklore speaks of hidden valleys where abandoned settlements slowly disappeared beneath drifting earth, preserving their contents in remarkable condition. Others describe remote caves sealed by rockfalls, their entrances erased by centuries of natural change. Such stories have inspired occasional searches, fueled by the hope that somewhere beneath Khurasan's expansive landscape rests an untouched cache of Abbasid silver waiting to be rediscovered. There are even those who view the caravan through a symbolic lens rather than a literal one. In this interpretation, the missing silver represents the countless historical details erased by time itself. Empires leave impressive monuments and celebrated chronicles, yet ordinary logistics, financial transactions, and regional expeditions often vanish from memory despite their importance. The caravan becomes less a single event and more a reminder of how fragile historical documentation can be. Modern archaeology continues to reshape our understanding of medieval trade throughout Central Asia and the broader Iranian world. Excavations have uncovered forgotten caravanserais, abandoned settlements, hidden coin hoards, and long-buried stretches of ancient roads. Every discovery demonstrates that commercial networks were even more extensive than earlier historians imagined. Even so, none has conclusively identified the caravan described in these traditions, or explained what ultimately became of its valuable cargo. Perhaps the greatest mystery is not whether the silver still exists, but whether future discoveries might reveal that the entire story unfolded differently from the version that has survived. Somewhere along the old roads of Khurasan, where the wind still carries dust across stones polished by generations of travelers, the missing caravan remains suspended between documented possibility, local memory, and the quiet hope that one overlooked clue could finally illuminate its forgotten path. Just as the missing Abbasid caravan leaves historians searching for a trail that dissolves into the landscape, our next mystery follows another path that seems to end without explanation. This time, the search leads far from the trade routes of Khurasan to a rugged mountain frontier where dense forests, mist-covered ridges, and forgotten valleys have concealed their own secrets for centuries. Here, silence has become as much a part of the story as the people who once lived among these peaks. At dawn, the upper Carpathians emerge from a sea of drifting fog. Towering spruce and beech forests blanket the slopes, while narrow streams carve their way through steep ravines hidden beneath thick canopies of green. In winter, deep snow transforms the landscape into an almost impenetrable wilderness. Even today, large portions of these mountains remain remarkably isolated, preserving an atmosphere that feels untouched by time. For generations, the Carpathian Mountains have served as both refuge and frontier. Communities settled in sheltered valleys, shepherds guided their flocks through alpine meadows, and travelers crossed difficult mountain passes linking Central and Eastern Europe. Yet the same terrain that protected those seeking solitude also concealed countless places from the outside world. Among the most enduring traditions of the region is the story of a secluded monastery said to have existed somewhere within the Upper Carpathians. Unlike the great monasteries recorded in royal charters or ecclesiastical archives, this community appears only in scattered references, local folklore, and occasional remarks preserved in later chronicles. According to these accounts, monks established a remote sanctuary where prayer, scholarship, and quiet devotion flourished far from political struggles and expanding kingdoms. The historical background makes such a settlement entirely possible. From the early medieval period onward, monastic communities often sought isolation. Rugged mountains offered protection from conflict while providing the solitude considered essential for spiritual contemplation. Throughout Eastern Europe, hermits and small religious communities occupied caves, forests, and remote valleys, leaving behind modest churches, carved crosses, and handwritten manuscripts. Many existed with little direct contact beyond nearby villages. The challenge begins when historians attempt to identify the monastery described in regional traditions. No confirmed archaeological site has been matched with the accounts. Surviving documents offer only vague geographical clues, mentioning forested ridges, hidden valleys, or streams whose names have changed repeatedly over the centuries. Medieval place names often disappeared as borders shifted and populations moved, making it increasingly difficult to connect written descriptions with modern landscapes. One explanation is surprisingly ordinary. Small monasteries frequently disappeared through gradual abandonment rather than sudden catastrophe. Declining populations, changing trade routes, warfare, disease, or economic hardship could reduce a thriving religious community to only a handful of residents. Once abandoned, wooden structures would decay rapidly beneath harsh mountain weather, leaving little visible evidence after several centuries. Nature itself may have erased much of the physical record. The Carpathians are shaped by landslides, flooding, dense vegetation, and continuous forest growth. Fallen trees, shifting soil, and seasonal erosion slowly transform abandoned clearings into woodland once again. Stone foundations become buried beneath moss and roots, while narrow footpaths disappear beneath layers of leaves. A monastery built from local timber could vanish so completely that only subtle changes in the terrain would hint that people once lived there. Yet certain accounts refuse to fade. Villagers from different parts of the region have long spoken of weathered stone walls glimpsed through heavy mist or unusual clearings discovered deep within the forest before somehow becoming impossible to find again. Others describe ancient bells faintly echoing across mountain valleys during quiet mornings, despite no nearby church standing within many kilometers. These stories cannot be verified through historical evidence, but they have remained remarkably persistent across generations. Some researchers interpret such traditions through the lens of memory rather than mystery. Oral histories often preserve genuine locations long after precise directions have been forgotten. A ruined chapel, encountered occasionally by shepherds or hunters, may gradually become the legendary lost monastery as each generation adds new details, while older landmarks disappear from collective memory. More speculative theories suggest that the monastery may have served another purpose beyond spiritual life. During periods of political instability, isolated religious communities occasionally protected valuable manuscripts, sacred relics, or important correspondence. If the monastery sheltered such treasures, deliberate secrecy may have contributed to its disappearance from official records. Could documents have been hidden rather than destroyed, waiting somewhere within an undiscovered chamber or forgotten cellar beneath centuries of forest growth? Archaeological surveys throughout the Carpathian region continue to reveal previously unknown medieval settlements, churches, and defensive structures. Modern technologies, including airborne laser scanning capable of detecting subtle features beneath dense woodland, have transformed the study of heavily forested landscapes. Each newly identified site reminds researchers that the mountains still conceal traces of communities once believed entirely lost. Even so, the monastery described in these traditions remains unidentified. No inscription bears its name with certainty. No manuscript records its final days. No excavation has confirmed its location beyond reasonable doubt. Perhaps the Upper Carpathians have simply protected one small chapter of medieval life more successfully than any fortress ever could. Or perhaps the monastery survives only because history, folklore, and landscape have become so closely intertwined that separating one from the others is no longer possible. Somewhere among the quiet valleys and endless forests, where morning mist still settles between the ancient trees, the answer may be waiting beneath layers of earth, roots, and time, unseen by everyone who has passed nearby without realizing what lies just beyond the next ridge. If the forests of the Upper Carpathians remind us how entire communities can disappear beneath centuries of natural change, the next mystery shifts from hidden buildings to something even more fragile: written memory itself. Stone walls may crumble and timber may decay, but the loss of a library or archive can erase generations of knowledge in a single moment. Our search now moves southward, to a kingdom whose history was carefully recorded until those records themselves seemed to slip into silence. Inside a royal archive, the air would have carried the scent of parchment, ink, and polished wood. Shelves lined with carefully rolled manuscripts preserved dynastic genealogies, land grants, diplomatic correspondence, tax registers, military agreements, and royal decrees. Each document represented more than words on parchment. Together, they formed the institutional memory of a kingdom, preserving legal rights, political alliances, and the stories of rulers whose authority depended as much on written records as on military strength. For centuries, the Armenian highlands stood at the crossroads of powerful empires. Kingdoms rose and declined while neighboring states competed for influence across the region. Armenian nobles, church leaders, and royal courts developed a rich literary tradition, preserving chronicles and official documents that remain among the most valuable historical sources for understanding the medieval Caucasus. Yet many historians believe that an even larger collection once existed. Several medieval writers refer indirectly to royal archives that contained administrative records extending across generations. Although these references are often brief, They suggest that official collections were maintained by successive rulers to organize governance and preserve legal continuity. Such archives would have been indispensable during periods of political negotiation, inheritance disputes, and diplomatic communication with neighboring powers. The mystery begins during the turbulent centuries of Arab expansion into the region. Beginning in the 7th century, Arab armies entered the Armenian highlands as broader political transformations reshaped the Near East. Control of territories shifted repeatedly, and local rulers negotiated alliances, submitted to new authorities, or resisted military campaigns depending upon rapidly changing circumstances. Fortified cities changed hands, monasteries faced uncertain futures, and royal centers became vulnerable to warfare, unlike anything experienced in previous generations. Within this period of upheaval, later traditions speak of the disappearance of a substantial Armenian royal archive. What became of those documents has never been established with certainty. The most straightforward explanation points toward the harsh realities of medieval conflict. Archives were often stored within royal compounds or administrative centers that became military objectives during sieges. Fire posed an especially devastating threat. A single blaze could consume thousands of parchment manuscripts within hours, leaving little trace beyond fragments of charred bindings or scattered ashes. Throughout medieval history, invaluable collections disappeared in precisely this manner. Another possibility involves deliberate removal rather than destruction. During times of invasion, officials frequently attempted to safeguard important records by relocating them to monasteries, mountain fortresses, or other secure locations. Armenia possessed an extensive network of religious centers, whose libraries became guardians of historical manuscripts for centuries. Could trusted custodians have carried portions of the royal archive into remote valleys before advancing armies arrived? If so, where were those documents ultimately taken, and why do they no longer appear in surviving catalogs? Political change introduces another layer of uncertainty. When governments fall, official records sometimes lose their immediate purpose. Administrative systems evolve, new authorities establish different legal structures, and documents once considered essential gradually become neglected. Over decades or centuries, manuscripts may be dispersed among private collections, religious institutions, or regional archives without preserving any indication of their original source. In such cases, the archive would not have vanished all at once, but would instead have dissolved slowly into history. Certain scholars also point to the incomplete nature of medieval documentation itself. References to a royal archive may not describe one centralized repository, but rather several collections maintained by different noble families or administrative offices. If these were scattered across multiple locations, later generations might have remembered them collectively as a single lost archive, simplifying a far more complex historical reality. Even so, several questions continue to invite deeper reflection. Why do some chronicles allude to official records that no longer exist? Why do certain royal genealogies appear unusually incomplete, as though earlier sources had once been available but later disappeared? And why do occasional manuscripts preserve tantalizing references to documents that modern historians have never located? More speculative theories imagine hidden chambers within ancient monasteries or fortified castles where important manuscripts were concealed during periods of crisis. Throughout the Armenian highlands, forgotten storage rooms, sealed basements, and inaccessible caves have occasionally yielded remarkable discoveries. Medieval manuscripts believed lost for centuries have emerged from isolated monasteries, demonstrating that historical treasures sometimes survive in the most unexpected places. Others wonder whether fragments of the royal archive may still exist without being recognized. A damaged legal charter preserved in one collection, a diplomatic letter catalogued under another title, or an overlooked manuscript stored in a remote monastery could represent surviving pieces of a much larger archive whose original identity has long been forgotten. Modern historians continue comparing chronicles, legal documents, church records, and archaeological evidence in hopes of reconstructing at least part of what has been lost. Every newly translated manuscript contributes another small detail, gradually illuminating a past that remains incomplete. Yet the central mystery endures. Did the royal archive perish amid the violence of political transformation? Was it quietly hidden from danger? Or has it survived in fragments scattered so widely that no one has yet realized they once belonged to the same remarkable collection? Somewhere within forgotten libraries, ancient monasteries, or unopened repositories, the missing pages of a kingdom's memory may still be waiting to be found. If the disappearance of the Armenian royal archive reveals how written memory can fade as completely as a ruined city, the next mystery follows the people entrusted with creating that very history. Diplomats carried more than letters and official seals. They transported alliances, intelligence, and the fragile hopes of kingdoms seeking peace or influence. When such envoys failed to return, their absence often left questions that echoed far beyond the borders they had crossed. The grasslands stretch endlessly beneath an open sky, where powerful rivers weave through forests and broad steppes before emptying into distant seas. Winds sweep across the landscape without interruption, carrying little evidence of those who once traveled these ancient routes. Merchant caravans, mounted warriors, and diplomatic missions all passed through this immense frontier, connecting the kingdoms of Western Europe with the great powers of the Eurasian steppe. During the early medieval period, one of the most influential states in this vast region was the Khazar Khaganate. Positioned between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, the Khazars controlled strategic trade routes linking northern Europe, the Byzantine Empire, the Islamic world, and Central Asia. Their territory became a meeting point for merchants, scholars, soldiers, and diplomats representing cultures separated by thousands of miles. The Frankish kingdoms, meanwhile, were steadily expanding their political influence across Western Europe. Rulers sought diplomatic relationships not only with neighboring realms, but also with distant powers whose cooperation could shape commerce, military strategy, and regional stability. Long-distance embassies were difficult and dangerous, yet they formed an essential part of medieval diplomacy. Among the many diplomatic traditions preserved in scattered historical references is the account of Frankish envoys dispatched to the Khazar court. The details remain frustratingly limited. Several medieval sources confirm that diplomatic contact between Western Europe and the Khazars occurred at various points. Messengers traveled remarkable distances carrying official correspondence, gifts, and proposals intended to strengthen political relationships. Such missions often required months or even years to complete, crossing unfamiliar territories governed by numerous independent rulers before reaching their intended destination. Yet according to later traditions, one embassy appears to have disappeared somewhere along this demanding journey. The surviving records never provide a clear ending. No confirmed report describes the envoys arriving safely at the Khazar court. Likewise, no reliable account records their successful return to Frankish territory. Instead, the historical trail gradually narrows until it disappears altogether, leaving historians with only fragments that suggest an unfinished diplomatic mission. The simplest explanation points toward the immense challenges of medieval travel. A diplomatic delegation crossing Eastern Europe faced countless hazards. Rivers flooded without warning. Forests concealed organized raiders. Disease spread rapidly among travelers, and political conditions could shift long before messengers reached their destination. Even experienced guides could become lost while navigating unfamiliar territory stretching across thousands of kilometers. Another possibility lies in the complexity of steppe politics. The Eurasian frontier was not controlled by a single authority. Numerous tribes, local rulers, and competing powers occupied different regions between the Frankish kingdoms and the Khazar capital. Diplomatic travelers required safe passage through territories where alliances frequently changed. Could the envoys have become entangled in conflicts unrelated to their mission, detained by suspicious rulers who viewed foreign ambassadors as potential spies rather than peaceful representatives? Communication itself presented another challenge. Unlike modern diplomacy, medieval embassies often disappeared from written records simply because few opportunities existed to report their progress. If the delegation suffered delays, altered its route, or remained abroad for an extended period, later chroniclers might have assumed the mission had failed altogether. The silence preserved in surviving manuscripts may reflect incomplete documentation rather than an unexplained disappearance. Some historians suggest the embassy reached the Khazar court, but never returned for political reasons now lost to history. Diplomatic negotiations occasionally resulted in extended residence abroad, voluntary service under foreign rulers, or integration into local administrative structures. Individuals possessing valuable linguistic or political skills sometimes found new roles far from their original homeland. Yet the mystery has inspired broader interpretations. The Khazar capital itself remains an archaeological puzzle. Although researchers have identified several possible locations associated with Khazar political centers, much of the kingdom's physical landscape remains imperfectly understood. If the envoys reached a city whose precise location is still debated today, could traces of their presence remain undiscovered beneath layers of earth along the lower Volga or nearby river systems? Other theories focus on the remarkable diversity of peoples living throughout the region. Greek, Arabic, Turkic, Slavic, Norse, and Persian influences overlapped along these trade corridors, producing an extraordinary exchange of cultures and languages. In such a setting, foreign visitors might gradually become absorbed into local communities, leaving descendants but little documentary evidence connecting them to their original mission. There are also traditions suggesting that diplomatic correspondence itself may have held greater significance than the travelers carrying it. Official letters sometimes addressed matters of military cooperation, trade privileges, or religious dialogue whose contents were considered highly sensitive. If those documents disappeared alongside the envoys, valuable insight into one of medieval Europe's most distant diplomatic relationships may have vanished with them. Modern archaeology continues revealing forgotten settlements, fortified trading centers, and burial sites across territories once influenced by the Khazars. Every excavation expands our understanding of a civilization that played a crucial role in connecting continents. Even so, none has conclusively answered what became of the Frankish delegation described in later traditions. Perhaps the greatest mystery is not whether the envoys completed their journey, but whether history simply failed to preserve the final chapter of their mission. Somewhere along the rivers, forests, and sweeping grasslands that once connected distant kingdoms, the story may still exist, hidden within an overlooked manuscript, an unexcavated settlement, or a discovery waiting patiently beneath the soil of the Eurasian frontier. If the missing Frankish envoys remind us how easily travelers could disappear along the great diplomatic roads of the medieval world, our next mystery follows a very different kind of journey. These travelers were not merchants, soldiers, or ambassadors. They sought neither wealth nor political influence. Instead, they walked willingly into one of the harshest landscapes on earth, believing that silence itself could bring them closer to the divine. Yet for some of them, that silence became permanent. At sunrise, the Egyptian eastern desert glows with shades of copper and pale gold. Jagged mountain ridges cast long shadows across dry valleys where no rivers flow, and scattered acacia trees struggle against an unforgiving climate. Ancient tracks wind between rocky hills before disappearing into endless expanses of gravel and sand. During the day, temperatures rise with relentless intensity. After sunset, the same landscape becomes unexpectedly cold, while the stars illuminate a wilderness that seems almost untouched by human history. To many, the desert appears empty, yet appearances can be deceiving. Long before modern roads crossed this region, the eastern desert served as an important corridor linking the Nile Valley with the Red Sea. Egyptian expeditions searched these mountains for gold, emeralds, and valuable stone. Roman engineers later constructed roads, wells, and fortified stations to support commerce and military movement. Even today, archaeologists continue to uncover abandoned mining settlements, isolated watchtowers, and weathered inscriptions carved into cliffs by travelers who passed through nearly 2,000 years ago. By the 3rd and 4th centuries AD, the landscape acquired another identity. It became a place of retreat. Christian ascetics, inspired by figures such as Saint Anthony the Great and the early Desert Fathers, withdrew into the wilderness, seeking lives devoted entirely to prayer, contemplation, fasting, and solitude. Their choice transformed the Egyptian deserts into one of the birthplaces of Christian monasticism. Small hermit cells appeared among rocky cliffs, while larger monasteries gradually emerged around reliable springs and sheltered valleys. Historical records describe remarkable acts of endurance. Some monks survived for decades with little more than bread, water, dates, and the support of neighboring communities. Others lived almost complete lives of isolation, receiving visitors only occasionally for spiritual guidance. Pilgrims traveled enormous distances simply to hear their wisdom, recording stories that blended first-hand observation with admiration for extraordinary devotion. Many of these communities are well documented, others are not. Among scattered monastic writings and later traditions are references to groups of monks who ventured even farther into the eastern desert than their better-known contemporaries. Rather than settling near established monasteries, these ascetics reportedly sought locations so remote that contact with the outside world became exceedingly rare. Some accounts describe small bands disappearing beyond familiar routes, determined to find perfect solitude in landscapes almost no one else wished to enter. Then the historical record becomes uncertain. Certain names appear only once before disappearing entirely. Small communities mentioned in one manuscript are never described again. Pilgrims who expected to revisit isolated hermits sometimes reported finding abandoned shelters, extinguished hearths, or caves left completely empty. Whether these absences reflected ordinary mortality, migration, or something more unusual remains impossible to determine. The most practical explanation begins with the environment itself. The eastern desert is among the world's most demanding landscapes. Water sources can fail after prolonged drought, while seasonal flash floods race through otherwise dry valleys with astonishing force. Navigation depends upon intimate knowledge of the terrain, and even experienced travelers risk becoming disoriented among seemingly identical ridges and winding ravines. A small religious community living far beyond established routes could disappear through natural causes alone, leaving little evidence for future generations to discover. Isolation also carried significant physical risks. Illness, injury, or simple exhaustion could become fatal when assistance lay days away. Unlike larger monasteries, which maintained gardens, wells, workshops, and mutual support, solitary settlements depended upon extremely limited resources. A succession of difficult years might gradually force residents to abandon their retreat without leaving written explanations. Political instability added another layer of uncertainty. Throughout late antiquity and the early medieval period, Egypt experienced changing administrations, economic disruptions, and periods of regional conflict. Trade routes shifted, military patrols changed, and support networks connecting isolated monasteries with the Nile Valley were not always reliable. Even modest interruptions in supplies could place remote communities under severe pressure. Archaeological discoveries have demonstrated that many desert settlements once believed legendary were, in fact, entirely real. Excavations have uncovered forgotten hermitages hidden within cliffs, rock-cut chapels decorated with faded frescoes, and abandoned monastic complexes preserved beneath centuries of drifting sand and stone. These discoveries remind historians that absence from written records does not necessarily mean a place never existed. Even so, some accounts remain difficult to explain. Later pilgrims occasionally wrote of finding signs that suggested people had occupied isolated caves only a short time before their arrival, despite local traditions insisting no monks had lived there for many years. Simple stone altars appeared unexpectedly among remote hills. Fragments of pottery and weathered crosses surfaced far from any known monastery. Were these traces left by undocumented communities, or did they belong to travelers whose identities have been forgotten? Local traditions introduce still another perspective. Among communities living near the desert's edge, stories have circulated for generations about hidden valleys where ascetics continued their lives beyond the awareness of ordinary society. According to these accounts, certain monks intentionally concealed their locations, believing complete anonymity to be the final expression of humility. Visitors who approached with sincere intentions might receive guidance, while others wandered past without ever noticing the secluded dwellings nearby. These stories cannot be verified through historical evidence, yet they echo a central principle found within early monastic literature. Many desert fathers sought not recognition but invisibility, believing that spiritual achievement lost its value when admired by others. Could some communities have succeeded so completely in withdrawing from the world that they eventually disappeared from history altogether? More speculative theories move beyond conventional historical interpretation. Some suggest that hidden cave systems within the eastern desert may still contain undiscovered chapels, manuscripts, or burial chambers belonging to forgotten monastic groups. The region's rugged topography includes countless inaccessible ravines, natural shelters, and elevated plateaus that have received little archaeological attention. Satellite imagery and modern surveying technologies continue identifying structures previously concealed by the landscape, raising the possibility that additional sites remain untouched. Others focus on the remarkable psychological effects of prolonged isolation in extreme environments. Endless silence, intense heat, and vast open spaces have shaped human perception throughout history. Ancient religious writings often describe profound spiritual experiences occurring in the wilderness, experiences understood differently depending upon one's beliefs and cultural traditions. Could later accounts of mysterious disappearances reflect the symbolic language of these spiritual journeys, rather than literal historical events? Or do they preserve faint memories of communities whose final chapters simply went unrecorded? Today, the Egyptian Eastern Desert continues to reveal unexpected discoveries. Archaeologists regularly identify forgotten Roman outposts, abandoned mining settlements, and early Christian sites that remained hidden for centuries. Every expedition demonstrates that this seemingly empty landscape still guards remarkable pieces of the past beneath its rocky surface. Yet the fate of those monks who ventured deepest into the wilderness remains uncertain. Did they quietly perish within the harsh environment they willingly embraced? Did they relocate without leaving records, becoming absorbed into other religious communities? Or do forgotten hermitages still rest among isolated valleys where no modern survey has yet reached? If the silent valleys of Egypt remind us that entire spiritual communities can fade into the landscape they once embraced, the next mystery unfolds in a world almost opposite in character. Instead of sun-scorched cliffs and endless desert, the search leads into dense forests, mist-covered marshes, and wind-swept shores along the Baltic Sea. Here, sacred traditions were woven into ancient oak groves and quiet woodland clearings, and when those traditions disappeared, they left behind questions that still resist clear answers. Morning mist hangs low over the forests of old Prussia, drifting between towering oaks, dark pines, and still lakes that mirror the pale northern sky. The air is cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and moss, while narrow paths vanish into woodland so dense that daylight struggles to reach the forest floor. In these landscapes, nature itself seemed to shape belief. Rivers, stones, groves, and hills were not merely features of the land. They were places of meaning, guarded by customs that had endured for generations before written history reached the region. The people known today as the Old Prussians were a Baltic-speaking society whose homeland occupied territories along the southeastern coast of the Baltic Sea. Long before the arrival of Christian kingdoms and military crusades, they developed a complex spiritual tradition centered on sacred natural places, seasonal ceremonies, and a deep connection with the surrounding environment. Unlike many neighboring civilizations, the Old Prussians left behind very few written records of their own. Most surviving descriptions come from outside observers, chroniclers, missionaries, and later historians who viewed Prussian beliefs through unfamiliar cultural and religious perspectives. As a result, modern researchers must reconstruct much of their spiritual world from fragmented accounts, archaeology, place names, and oral traditions that survived long after the original practices had begun to disappear. Among the most intriguing figures mentioned in these scattered sources are the pagan priests who guided religious ceremonies within Old Prussian society. Some medieval writers describe respected spiritual leaders responsible for maintaining sacred sites, interpreting rituals, preserving ancestral traditions, and overseeing seasonal festivals. Certain accounts even refer to a high religious authority associated with an important sanctuary known as Romuva, though historians continue debating whether this institution truly existed in the form later chroniclers described, or whether its significance grew through centuries of retelling. Whatever their precise role, these religious leaders occupied an important place within Prussian society. Then, during the 13th century, everything changed. Military campaigns launched by the Teutonic Order transformed the region through prolonged warfare, political conquest, and Christianization. Fortified settlements were captured, local resistance continued for decades, and traditional religious practices faced increasing pressure as new political and religious systems became established. It is within this turbulent period that the mystery emerges. The pagan priests who had once guided ceremonies across Old Prussia seem to disappear from the historical record with remarkable speed. Some chronicles mention their resistance to conversion. Others suggest that sacred groves were destroyed and ritual centers abandoned. Yet the surviving evidence rarely explains what ultimately became of the individuals themselves. Their names are seldom recorded. Their final movements remain almost entirely unknown. The most direct explanation follows the broader course of medieval history. Religious transformation often displaced existing spiritual leaders. Some priests may have been killed during military campaigns or local uprisings. Others could have fled into remote forests alongside communities resisting outside rule. As political authority shifted, many traditional religious roles simply ceased to exist, gradually dissolving as younger generations adopted new beliefs. Archaeological evidence supports portions of this interpretation. Excavations throughout the former lands of Old Prussia have uncovered settlements showing signs of destruction, abandonment, and cultural transition during the medieval crusading period. Sacred sites associated with earlier religious traditions appear to have declined, while churches, castles, and new administrative centers gradually reshaped the landscape. Yet, archaeology cannot easily reveal the fate of individuals. Another possibility suggests a quieter ending. Rather than disappearing suddenly, the priests may have adapted to changing circumstances. Local customs often survived beneath the surface of official religious life, blending older traditions with newer practices throughout Europe. Elements of pre-Christian belief continued within seasonal festivals, folklore, and rural customs for centuries. Could former spiritual leaders have remained within their communities, preserving fragments of ancient traditions in forms subtle enough to escape the attention of contemporary chroniclers? Language itself hints at this possibility. Many place names throughout the Baltic region preserve references to sacred groves, holy hills, springs, and ritual landscapes long after their original meanings faded from public memory. These names suggest that cultural memory endured even when organized religious institutions disappeared. Some historians believe that the scarcity of reliable written sources has exaggerated the mystery. Medieval chroniclers often focused on dramatic events while overlooking gradual cultural change. If the priesthood declined over several generations rather than vanishing during a single historical moment, later writers may have condensed that long process into a simpler narrative of sudden disappearance. Still, several traditions continue to invite curiosity. Regional folklore collected centuries later speaks of elderly guardians who secretly tended sacred oak groves long after public ceremonies had ended. Other stories describe hidden woodland sanctuaries where ancient rituals continued beneath the cover of darkness, known only to a small number of trusted families. While such accounts cannot be confirmed through historical evidence, they reflect the enduring belief that some traditions refuse to disappear completely. The forests themselves contribute to the mystery. Across northern Europe, dense woodland has preserved archaeological sites remarkably well. Buried shrines, ceremonial enclosures, wooden idols, and ritual deposits have occasionally emerged from wetlands where oxygen-poor conditions slowed the decay of organic materials. Every new excavation demonstrates that landscapes once dismissed as empty often conceal evidence of forgotten belief systems beneath layers of soil and vegetation. More speculative theories imagine that isolated religious communities withdrew deliberately into inaccessible forests, continuing their traditions beyond the reach of conquering authorities. Such ideas remain unproven, yet they draw inspiration from similar historical patterns elsewhere, where minority groups preserved customs by retreating into remote environments. Others suggest that the greatest mystery is not where the priests went, but how much of their knowledge disappeared with them. Religious specialists often served as keepers of oral history, seasonal calendars, legal customs, and ancestral traditions. Without written records, the passing of only 1 or 2 generations could erase centuries of accumulated knowledge, leaving behind little more than scattered legends whose original meanings became impossible to recover. Modern archaeology, historical linguistics, and environmental research continue offering new insights into the spiritual landscape of Old Prussia. Ancient pollen studies reveal long-term patterns of woodland management around sacred sites. Excavations uncover ritual objects once hidden beneath forest floors. Linguists reconstruct fragments of the Old Prussian language from surviving documents, helping historians better understand the culture that produced them. Yet the priests themselves remain elusive. No confirmed burial identifies one with certainty. No preserved manuscript records their own understanding of the beliefs they practiced. No hidden sanctuary has revealed the complete story of how their traditions ended, or whether they truly ended at all. Perhaps the forests of Old Prussia still guard more than ancient trees and forgotten pathways. Somewhere beneath moss-covered stones, beneath roots that have grown undisturbed for centuries, or within overlooked fragments of oral tradition passed quietly from one generation to the next, traces of those vanished spiritual guardians may still survive. Until new evidence emerges, their final chapter remains suspended between documented history, enduring folklore, and the quiet silence of the northern woods that once formed the heart of their sacred world. If the forests of Old Prussia preserved only faint echoes of a vanished priesthood, the next mystery leads to a very different landscape, where memory is etched not into towering trees, but into black volcanic stone. Here, abandoned walls still stand against the wind, their silence broken only by shifting sand and the distant calls of birds. Unlike forgotten forests that slowly reclaim the past, This place has remained visible for centuries, inviting every visitor to ask the same quiet question: why did its final guardians leave without a trace? Across the basalt plains of northern Jordan stands the remarkable settlement of al-Jimal. Built almost entirely from dark volcanic stone, its towers, homes, churches, courtyards, and defensive structures rise from the surrounding landscape with an appearance both imposing and strangely timeless. The black masonry absorbs the changing light throughout the day, transforming from deep charcoal before dawn to warm shades of brown beneath the afternoon sun. Even after centuries of abandonment, many of its buildings remain standing, creating one of the most striking archaeological landscapes in the Middle East. The settlement occupies a strategic position near the edge of the Khurasan, where cultivated farmland gradually gives way to more arid terrain. For thousands of years, this frontier connected communities moving between the Arabian Peninsula, the Levant, and the broader Roman and Byzantine worlds. Water was precious, and survival depended upon carefully engineered reservoirs, cisterns, and channels capable of capturing seasonal rainfall. Long before it became an archaeological treasure, al-Jimal served many different purposes. During the Roman period, it functioned as an important frontier settlement associated with the empire's eastern defenses. Soldiers, merchants, farmers, and travelers all passed through its gates. As political authority evolved under the Byzantine Empire, the community expanded, churches replaced older public buildings, and local commerce continued to flourish. Even after the early Islamic period began, evidence suggests that people remained in the settlement, adapting rather than abandoning their homes overnight. Yet somewhere within this long history lies an enduring mystery. Archaeologists have spent decades studying al-Jimal, uncovering inscriptions, domestic structures, churches, workshops, and defensive architecture. The evidence reveals gradual change rather than sudden destruction. Unlike many ancient cities, there is little indication that the settlement ended through catastrophic warfare or a single devastating attack. Instead, the final phase appears unusually quiet. Among the most intriguing questions concerns the settlement's last defenders, those responsible for maintaining security along this frontier during its closing years as an occupied stronghold. What became of them? The historical record offers remarkably few answers. No surviving chronicle clearly describes the departure of the final garrison. No inscription commemorates a victorious defense or a formal surrender. There is no dramatic account of overwhelming invasion forcing desperate soldiers to flee. Instead, the evidence suggests something far less dramatic, yet perhaps even more mysterious. The fortress simply ceased to function. The most widely accepted explanation centers on gradual economic and environmental change. Throughout late antiquity and the early medieval period, regional trade routes evolved as political priorities shifted. Settlements that once occupied strategic positions sometimes found themselves bypassed by newer roads or changing commercial networks. Maintaining military outposts required considerable resources, and authorities often concentrated their limited manpower where it could provide the greatest benefit. Under such circumstances, a frontier garrison might simply receive orders to relocate, leaving behind walls that no longer justified permanent occupation. Environmental factors may also have played an important role. Although al-Jimal possessed sophisticated systems for collecting water, prolonged climatic fluctuations could still affect agriculture and daily life. Even modest reductions in reliable rainfall might gradually encourage families and soldiers alike to seek more dependable settlements elsewhere. Unlike sudden disasters, these changes often unfold across generations, leaving few obvious traces in the archaeological record. Earthquakes deserve consideration as well. The broader region has experienced significant seismic activity throughout history. Archaeological evidence indicates that earthquakes damaged many settlements across the Levant during different periods. Yet at al-Jimal, researchers generally see evidence of repeated adaptation and rebuilding rather than immediate abandonment. If earthquakes contributed to the site's decline, they appear to have done so as one factor among many, rather than as a single decisive event. Still, certain details continue to attract attention. Several buildings appear to have been left in an orderly state rather than hurriedly evacuated. Everyday objects remained where they had been used, while architectural features suggest that departures occurred without widespread panic. Such evidence raises an intriguing possibility. Did the inhabitants expect to return? Was the withdrawal viewed as temporary, only for circumstances to prevent their return in later years? Another theory points toward administrative transformation rather than physical disappearance. As regional political structures evolved under successive governments, military responsibilities often shifted from one location to another. Garrisons could be reassigned, merged, or dissolved entirely without attracting significant attention from chroniclers focused on larger political events. If this occurred at al-Jimal, the final soldiers may have simply marched away under official orders, leaving behind a settlement whose strategic importance had quietly faded. Yet not every explanation remains firmly within conventional history. Local traditions collected over many generations occasionally speak of unusual lights moving among the abandoned towers after sunset, or distant voices carried by the wind through empty streets. Such accounts belong to folklore rather than documented history, yet they reflect the powerful impression created by the city's remarkably preserved architecture. Walking through deserted buildings that still resemble inhabited neighborhoods naturally encourages imagination, particularly in a place where so much remains standing despite centuries of silence. Some researchers have suggested that undiscovered inscriptions may still exist within collapsed structures or buried debris. Throughout the ancient Near East, seemingly insignificant fragments of stone have transformed historical understanding by preserving names, official decrees, or brief administrative records. A single overlooked inscription could reveal the identity of a commander, record the transfer of a military unit, or explain why the settlement's final defenders departed. Modern archaeological methods continue revealing new details about al-Jimal. High-resolution mapping, drone surveys, architectural analysis, and environmental studies have reconstructed aspects of daily life with remarkable precision. Researchers now understand far more about water management, trade, domestic life, and religious practice than earlier generations could have imagined. Yet despite these advances, the closing chapter of the settlement's military history remains incomplete. Perhaps the mystery persists because history does not always end with dramatic battles or famous victories. Sometimes an important place simply grows quieter. A gate is closed for the last time. A watchtower no longer receives its evening guard. Footsteps that echoed through narrow streets gradually disappear, leaving only empty buildings to preserve the memory of those who once stood watch. Today, the dark basalt walls of al-Jimal continue to overlook the surrounding plain much as they did centuries ago. They have survived empires, shifting frontiers, changing faiths, and the passage of countless generations. Yet they reveal almost nothing about the final soldiers who called this frontier home. Whether they departed under peaceful orders, followed new opportunities elsewhere, or left behind records still hidden beneath layers of collapsed stone, their story remains unfinished. In the quiet spaces between those ancient walls, where sunlight falls across abandoned courtyards and silent towers, the last chapter of the fortress still waits for someone to uncover it. At first light, the harbor awakens beneath a veil of drifting mist. Tall wooden masts sway gently with the tide, their rigging creaking in rhythm with the waves. Dock workers carry lacquered chests, bolts of silk, carefully wrapped ceramics, and sealed official documents toward waiting ships. Beyond the harbor, the open sea stretches toward a horizon that seems almost limitless, promising opportunity while concealing dangers impossible to predict. Every departing vessel carries more than cargo. It carries the expectations of an empire. During the 9th century AD, the Tang dynasty remained one of the most influential civilizations in the world. Although the empire faced growing internal challenges during the reign of Emperor Yizong, its political influence extended across extensive diplomatic and commercial networks. Ports along China's southeastern coast welcomed merchants from Arabia, Persia, Southeast Asia, Korea, and Japan. Luxury goods traveled in every direction, while tribute missions reinforced political relationships that stretched across thousands of kilometers. The tribute system was more than ceremonial exchange. Foreign envoys presented gifts to the imperial court, while imperial officials responded with honors, valuable goods, and formal recognition. These carefully organized missions demonstrated diplomacy, prestige, and mutual benefit. Maritime routes became essential arteries connecting distant kingdoms with the Tang court, and fleets crossing the South China Sea regularly transported both officials and extraordinary wealth. Within this network appears one of the more elusive maritime traditions associated with the late Tang period. According to later accounts preserved in scattered references and regional narratives, a tribute fleet connected to the court of Emperor Yizong departed on what should have been a routine diplomatic voyage. The ships reportedly carried tribute goods, official correspondence, valuable cargo, and experienced crews accustomed to navigating established sea routes. Such expeditions were not unusual. By the 9th century, Chinese mariners possessed sophisticated knowledge of seasonal monsoon winds, coastal navigation, and long-distance commerce. Then the record becomes unexpectedly quiet. No single contemporary source describes a dramatic catastrophe. There is no famous naval battle, no detailed report of piracy, and no celebrated rescue. Instead, later traditions suggest that the fleet simply failed to complete the journey as expected, leaving historians with fragments rather than a complete narrative. The most widely accepted explanation begins with the sea itself. The waters connecting southern China with Southeast Asia are among the busiest maritime corridors in history, but they are also among the most unpredictable. Seasonal typhoons can develop rapidly, producing enormous waves and powerful winds capable of overwhelming even well-built vessels. Before the development of modern forecasting, sailors depended upon experience, observation, and favorable timing. A single unexpected storm could scatter ships across hundreds of kilometers, separating vessels that might never reunite. Ocean currents introduce another possibility. A damaged fleet carried away from established routes could drift toward unfamiliar coastlines, isolated reefs, or uncharted islands. Without reliable opportunities for communication, survivors might establish temporary settlements, seek assistance from unfamiliar communities, or simply disappear into regions beyond the reach of Tang officials. Piracy must also be considered. Historical records confirm that piracy affected maritime trade throughout East and Southeast Asia during various periods of the Tang dynasty. Valuable cargoes attracted organized raiders who understood both commercial routes and seasonal patterns of navigation. If the tribute fleet encountered such attackers far from major ports, the loss might never have been fully documented, particularly during an era when internal unrest increasingly occupied the attention of the imperial government. Some historians suggest that the mystery owes as much to incomplete documentation as to maritime disaster. The final decades of the Tang dynasty were marked by growing political instability, regional rebellions, and administrative disruption. Countless official records disappeared during subsequent conflicts, while later historians reconstructed events from surviving fragments. It is entirely possible that detailed reports describing the fleet's fate once existed, but failed to survive the centuries that followed. yet several aspects continue to encourage deeper investigation. Chinese historical records from the Tang period are generally admired for their administrative detail. Tribute missions, diplomatic exchanges, and maritime commerce often received careful documentation. Why then does this particular tradition remain so indistinct? Was the fleet truly exceptional, or have later storytellers combined several separate incidents into a single enduring mystery? Archaeology has transformed this discussion in remarkable ways. Shipwrecks discovered in the South China Sea have revealed astonishing evidence of 9th century maritime trade. Cargoes containing ceramics, silver, spices, glassware, and luxury goods demonstrate the immense scale of commerce flourishing during the Tang era. Some wrecks preserve entire snapshots of medieval life beneath layers of sediment, their cargoes untouched for more than 1,000 years. Every new discovery reminds researchers that countless vessels remain undiscovered beneath the sea. Could one of those wrecks belong to the fleet described in later traditions? Marine archaeologists remain cautious. The oceans preserve remarkable artifacts, but identifying the precise identity of a ship is extraordinarily difficult. Wooden hulls decay, inscriptions disappear, and cargoes often resemble those carried by many contemporary vessels. Even if the missing fleet rests on the seabed, recognizing it with certainty may require evidence that has not yet emerged. Other theories move beyond natural disaster. Some researchers wonder whether political circumstances changed while the fleet was already at sea. Diplomatic priorities could shift rapidly during periods of instability. Ports might close, alliances dissolve, or regional conflicts interrupt carefully planned missions. Under such conditions, a fleet could alter its destination, divide into smaller groups, or remain abroad for extended periods before gradually disappearing from official attention. Regional folklore offers its own quiet additions to the story. Along portions of the East Asian coastline, tales have long circulated about ancient ships appearing through heavy fog before fading once more into the distance. Fishermen have spoken of unusual cargo recovered from deep waters and weathered anchors resting far from modern shipping lanes. These accounts belong to maritime tradition rather than documented history, yet they reflect humanity's enduring fascination with voyages that seem to end beyond the reach of memory. Modern technology continues to reshape the search. High-resolution sonar, remotely operated underwater vehicles, and satellite mapping have identified submerged landscapes and ancient shipwrecks once thought impossible to locate. Every expedition expands the known map of historic maritime trade, revealing how much still lies hidden beneath layers of sand, coral, and silt. The South China Sea alone is believed to contain thousands of undiscovered wrecks representing centuries of navigation. Yet the tribute fleet associated with the reign of Emperor Yizong remains an unresolved chapter. Did violent weather claim ships that faithfully followed established sea lanes? Were they intercepted by raiders whose own stories have long since disappeared? Did political upheaval erase the records needed to explain an otherwise ordinary mission? Or does the answer still rest beneath the waves, sealed inside the remains of a forgotten vessel waiting for the tide of discovery to uncover it? Until that moment arrives, the sea continues to guard its silence, preserving one more mystery within the endless rhythm of its tides. If the missing tribute fleet of the Tang court reminds us that the sea can conceal entire expeditions beneath its shifting surface, our next mystery begins where rivers meet the ocean. Here, the disappearance is not limited to a handful of ships or a diplomatic mission, but to ordinary families forced into flight by violence. Their destination should have been remembered. Instead, their trail gradually dissolves into scattered chronicles, leaving behind one of the quieter mysteries of the early medieval world. Morning fog settles over the broad waters of the Loire River as it winds toward the Atlantic Ocean. Wooden docks emerge slowly from the mist, while the towers of medieval Nantes stand above the riverbanks, watching over the natural gateway between inland Europe and the open sea. For centuries, merchants, pilgrims, fishermen, and nobles passed through this busy settlement, carrying goods and ideas between Brittany and the wider world. Yet the same river that brought prosperity also offered an open path for danger. During the 9th century AD, Western Europe experienced a period of repeated Viking raids that reshaped entire regions. Fast, shallow-draft longships allowed Scandinavian warriors to travel deep inland along navigable rivers, striking settlements that had once believed themselves safely removed from coastal attack. Monasteries, trading centers, and fortified towns became vulnerable to sudden assaults that often arrived with little warning. Among the most devastating of these events was the Viking sack of Nantes in 843 AD. Contemporary chronicles describe how Viking raiders entered the city during the Feast of St. John. The attack was swift and unexpected. Churches became places of panic rather than refuge, prominent citizens were killed, and much of the settlement descended into chaos. Although the surviving accounts differ in detail, they agree that the assault left deep political and social consequences throughout Brittany. For those who survived, remaining in the devastated city may have seemed impossible. Historical sources indicate that many inhabitants fled in the aftermath, seeking safety wherever they believed it could be found. Noble families, clergy, merchants, craftsmen, and ordinary villagers likely joined the movement, carrying whatever possessions they could rescue before leaving familiar homes behind. It is here that the historical record begins to thin. While chroniclers document the attack itself with relative confidence, the fate of many refugees becomes far less certain. Individual leaders appear again in later records, and some communities undoubtedly rebuilt elsewhere. Yet traditions preserved in later centuries speak of larger groups whose destinations remain unclear, communities that seem to disappear from history after beginning their journey away from Nantes. The simplest explanation reflects the realities of medieval migration. Refugees rarely traveled as a single organized population. Families separated, villages divided, and survivors sought protection wherever relatives, monasteries, or sympathetic rulers offered assistance. Rather than disappearing together, they may simply have scattered across Brittany and neighboring regions, gradually blending into existing communities where their distinct identity faded within only a few generations. The political situation of the period reinforces this possibility. The 9th century was marked by shifting alliances, local conflicts, and repeated Viking incursions affecting much of northwestern Europe. Even communities that escaped immediate destruction often relocated more than once in response to changing conditions. Population movement became an ordinary feature of life rather than an exceptional event, making precise documentation increasingly difficult. Another explanation lies within the limitations of surviving records. Many medieval documents from Brittany have not survived. Monastic libraries suffered destruction, political upheaval interrupted local administration, and countless manuscripts disappeared through fire, neglect, or later conflicts. It is entirely possible that detailed accounts describing refugee settlements once existed but were lost centuries ago, leaving modern historians with only isolated references. Yet several details continue to invite curiosity. Certain Breton traditions describe abandoned settlements whose origins remain uncertain. Place names scattered across western France occasionally preserve references suggesting the arrival of displaced communities, though connecting them directly to the refugees of Nantes remains difficult. Archaeological evidence sometimes reveals sudden occupation of previously quiet sites during the 9th century, but identifying the people who settled there is rarely straightforward. Some historians suggest that a portion of the refugees may have crossed the sea. Brittany maintained long-standing cultural and linguistic ties with Cornwall and Wales. Maritime travel across the English Channel was well established, and earlier migrations had already connected these regions for centuries. Could families escaping violence have sought refuge among communities sharing familiar traditions across the water? If they did, distinguishing them from earlier Breton settlers becomes almost impossible within surviving historical records. Others point toward inland monasteries. Religious institutions frequently sheltered displaced populations during periods of warfare. Monks copied manuscripts, maintained agricultural estates, and sometimes welcomed refugees fleeing conflict. If substantial numbers found sanctuary within remote monastic communities, they may simply have entered records under different local identities, their earlier connection to Nantes gradually disappearing from memory. There are also traditions that move beyond documented history. Breton folklore speaks of villages abandoned almost overnight, of travelers who entered dense forests seeking safety but were never seen again, and of hidden communities established far from major roads where descendants preserved old customs in relative isolation. Such stories cannot be verified through historical evidence, yet they reflect the emotional memory left by generations who experienced repeated displacement and uncertainty. The landscape itself may have contributed to the mystery. Much of medieval Brittany consisted of forests, marshes, and rugged coastal terrain where small settlements could remain remarkably isolated. Communities established during moments of crisis sometimes survived quietly for centuries before disappearing once more through changing economies, disease, or gradual depopulation. Archaeologists continue discovering forgotten farms, chapels, and villages concealed beneath later woodland or agricultural land, reminding us that entire communities can vanish from visible history without dramatic endings. Modern archaeology and historical geography continue adding new pieces to the puzzle. Excavations have revealed evidence of population shifts, changing settlement patterns, and fortified refuges dating to the Viking Age. Advances in environmental analysis help researchers identify periods of agricultural expansion and abandonment, offering indirect clues about where displaced populations may have settled. Even so, these methods rarely identify individual refugee groups with certainty. Perhaps the greatest challenge lies in the nature of survival itself. History often preserves the names of kings, bishops, and military commanders, while overlooking ordinary families whose lives unfolded beyond royal courts and famous monasteries. The refugees fleeing Nantes were not setting out to become historical mysteries. They were simply searching for safety. Their success may be precisely why they disappeared from the record, blending quietly into new communities rather than leaving behind dramatic accounts of their journey. Yet one question continues to linger along the mist-covered banks of the Loire. Did every refugee find a new beginning somewhere beyond the horizon, or did entire groups vanish amid the confusion of an age marked by invasion and uncertainty? Somewhere beneath forgotten village foundations, within overlooked monastic manuscripts, or hidden inside ancient family traditions passed from one generation to the next, fragments of their story may still endure, waiting patiently for history to recognize them once again. Morning mist clings to the low meadows near the Somme River, softening the contours of fields that have witnessed centuries of human conflict. Dew gathers on tall grasses, while scattered stands of willow and alder cast long reflections across quiet streams. At first glance, nothing suggests that this peaceful landscape once echoed with the sounds of clashing weapons, shouted commands, and desperate attempts to survive. Yet beneath the soil lies a history written not in monuments, but in lives abruptly interrupted. In the year 881 AD, this landscape became the setting for one of the Carolingian world's most significant military victories against Viking raiders. Known as the Battle of Saucourt, the confrontation brought together the forces of King Louis III and a large Viking army that had spent years raiding across northern Francia. Contemporary chronicles portray the battle as a decisive success for the Frankish forces, describing heavy Viking losses and celebrating the victory as proof that determined resistance could halt repeated invasions. The event quickly entered medieval memory. Poets praised the courage of the king. Chroniclers emphasized divine favor. Later generations remembered Saucourt as a rare turning point during an era often defined by uncertainty and relentless raids. Yet beneath the triumphant narrative lies a quieter question, one that receives remarkably little attention in surviving records. What became of all those who died on the battlefield? Medieval writers naturally focused on rulers, commanders, and the political consequences of victory. Ordinary soldiers rarely appeared by name. Even less attention was given to the difficult task that followed every major battle, identifying the dead, recovering bodies, and providing burial wherever circumstances allowed. According to later traditions associated with the battlefield, not every body could be identified. Some accounts describe large numbers of fallen warriors whose names were unknown even to those charged with burying them. Others suggest that bodies remained scattered across the landscape long enough to become impossible to distinguish with certainty. Whether these traditions preserve literal historical events or reflect broader realities of medieval warfare remains open to debate, but they raise questions that historians continue to consider. The most practical explanation begins with the nature of 9th century battle itself. Armies during this period were often assembled from different regions, local levies, noble retinues, and allied contingents. Uniform clothing did not exist in the modern sense. Equipment varied widely according to wealth and personal resources. Helmets, shields, and cloaks might offer clues to origin, but they rarely provided absolute certainty. Once battle ended, damaged armor, missing weapons, and the physical effects of combat could make recognition extraordinarily difficult. Many combatants also traveled far from home. Viking expeditions included warriors drawn from different Scandinavian communities, while Frankish forces combined soldiers serving numerous local lords. If a man fell beside companions who also perished, there might be no surviving witness capable of identifying him. Families waiting hundreds of kilometers away could spend the rest of their lives never learning precisely where a son, brother, or father had died. The practical realities of battlefield recovery created additional challenges. After major engagements, victors often faced urgent priorities. Wounded soldiers required immediate attention. Pursuit of retreating enemies sometimes continued for days. Valuable weapons, horses, and supplies had to be collected before weather or scavengers claimed them. Burial frequently occurred under significant time pressure, particularly during warm seasons when decomposition advanced rapidly. In such circumstances, individual identification was not always possible. Mass graves, though solemn, often represented the most practical solution. Archaeological discoveries across Europe have demonstrated that medieval battlefields sometimes contain communal burials where individuals were interred together with little evidence identifying their names or places of origin. These graves provide remarkable insight into weapons, injuries, nutrition, and health, yet they rarely reveal personal identities. Could something similar have occurred at Saucourt? No archaeological discovery has conclusively identified a mass grave directly associated with the battle. The precise location of the engagement itself remains a subject of scholarly discussion, with researchers comparing medieval texts, topography, and historical geography in hopes of narrowing the possibilities. Without certainty regarding the battlefield, locating burial sites becomes considerably more difficult. Some historians believe that later traditions concerning unidentified corpses simply reflect common experiences shared after many medieval battles. Chroniclers may have emphasized anonymous casualties to illustrate the immense human cost of conflict, rather than to document a unique historical event. Yet several aspects continue to encourage deeper reflection. The surviving written accounts celebrate an overwhelming Frankish victory, reporting exceptionally high Viking casualties. Medieval chroniclers often exaggerated numbers to magnify military success, making exact figures impossible to verify. If the battle proved smaller than later descriptions suggest, why did traditions emphasizing large numbers of unidentified dead develop? Conversely, if casualties were truly extensive, how were so many bodies managed with the limited resources available at the time? Another possibility concerns the movement of armies before the battle. Military campaigns rarely involved only professional warriors. Blacksmiths, servants, merchants, craftsmen, camp followers, clergy, and local guides often traveled alongside fighting forces. If violence spread beyond the primary battlefield, some of the dead may not have belonged to either army in the conventional sense. Could later generations have encountered graves containing individuals whose roles were never recorded in official accounts? The landscape itself complicates the search. Over more than 1,000 years, rivers have shifted course, fields have been cultivated repeatedly, villages have expanded, and natural erosion has altered the terrain. Evidence once visible on the surface may now lie deeply buried beneath agricultural soil or modern development. Every season changes the landscape a little more, making the recovery of subtle archaeological traces increasingly challenging. Modern scientific techniques offer cautious optimism. Ground-penetrating radar, aerial photography, LiDAR scanning, and geophysical surveys have transformed the investigation of ancient battlefields throughout Europe. Sites once believed lost have been rediscovered through careful analysis of soil disturbances, buried ditches, and concentrations of metal artifacts. Even tiny fragments of weaponry can reveal patterns of combat invisible to earlier generations of researchers. If the battlefield of Saucourt can eventually be identified with greater confidence, new discoveries may reshape current understanding. Human remains, should they be located and studied ethically, could reveal surprising details about the people who fought there. Scientific analysis might estimate geographical origins through isotopic evidence preserved within teeth, identify healed injuries reflecting earlier campaigns, or distinguish dietary differences suggesting diverse cultural backgrounds. Such information would not restore forgotten names, but it could restore fragments of forgotten lives. Beyond archaeology lies another mystery: the silence of memory. Medieval societies placed profound importance on remembrance. Monasteries recorded prayers for benefactors. Families preserved genealogies. Noble lineages celebrated heroic ancestors. Yet countless ordinary individuals disappeared almost completely from written history after their deaths. Their absence reminds us that surviving historical records represent only a fraction of the people who shaped the past. Regional folklore has occasionally added its own interpretations. Stories collected centuries later speak of wandering lights appearing above certain fields after heavy rain, as though forgotten souls still searched for recognition. Other traditions describe farmers uncovering ancient weapons while plowing, only to rebury them out of respect for those who had fallen. These accounts belong to folklore rather than verifiable history, yet they reveal how communities often preserve emotional connections to places marked by long-forgotten violence. Some researchers have also wondered whether unidentified bodies found after medieval battles occasionally included individuals from entirely unexpected backgrounds. Trade routes crossed military frontiers. Travelers could become trapped between opposing forces. Local villagers sometimes attempted to defend their homes, while others found themselves caught in violence they never intended to join. Without written records, distinguishing combatants from civilians may not always have been possible. The uncertainty surrounding Saucourt reflects a broader truth about early medieval warfare. Victories entered chronicles. Kings entered history. Anonymous soldiers often entered the earth. Their stories remained untold. Today, the fields near the Somme appear tranquil, shaped more by agriculture than by conflict. Birds cross open skies where banners once flew, and quiet streams continue their slow journey toward the sea. Few visitors would suspect that beneath this peaceful landscape may rest individuals whose identities were never recovered. As dawn spreads across the broad plain of the Wei River, the ancient city of Chang'an slowly emerges beneath a veil of morning light. Wide avenues stretch toward distant palace walls, while tiled rooftops shimmer beneath the rising sun. Watchtowers overlook carefully planned neighborhoods divided into orderly wards, and bustling markets gradually fill with merchants carrying silk, tea, lacquerware, spices, manuscripts, and goods gathered from every corner of Asia. At its height, Chang'an was more than a capital. It was one of the largest and most sophisticated cities on Earth, where diplomacy, scholarship, religion, commerce, and imperial authority converged within immense walls. Every street reflected the power of the Tang dynasty. Envoys from distant kingdoms arrived bearing tribute. Buddhist monks returned from long pilgrimages carrying sacred texts. Officials copied decrees that governed millions of subjects across an empire stretching from deserts to subtropical coastlines. Astronomers observed the heavens from imperial observatories, while historians carefully recorded events that would become the official memory of the dynasty itself. Yet beneath this remarkable achievement lay a constant danger shared by nearly every great city of the ancient and medieval world: fire. Despite its magnificent appearance, much of Chang'an was constructed from timber. Palaces, residences, administrative compounds, warehouses, libraries, temples, and markets all depended heavily upon wooden beams, columns, and roofs. During dry seasons, a single unattended flame could spread with astonishing speed, driven by strong winds through tightly built districts before organized efforts could contain it. Historical records confirm that Chang'an experienced multiple destructive fires throughout its long history. Imperial chronicles mention palace fires, market fires, accidental blazes, and disasters that damaged important government buildings. Some were localized incidents. Others consumed entire sections of the city, disrupting administration and forcing costly reconstruction. Fire was not an extraordinary event within Chang'an. It was a recurring challenge faced by every generation. Among these destructive episodes, later traditions speak of a particularly devastating blaze remembered as one of the city's great fires. The precise details remain uncertain. Different historical sources describe separate fires affecting Chang'an during different reigns, while later narratives occasionally merge these disasters into broader accounts of widespread destruction. Somewhere within this complicated historical picture emerges one enduring mystery: the disappearance of official records that may once have preserved invaluable knowledge about the Tang world. The importance of such records cannot be overstated. Imperial China maintained one of the most sophisticated bureaucratic systems in pre-modern history. Government officials documented taxation, census information, legal decisions, diplomatic correspondence, engineering projects, military deployments, astronomical observations, land ownership, court ceremonies, and countless administrative activities. Libraries associated with the imperial court housed not only government documents, but also philosophical works, scientific treatises, poetry, maps, and historical chronicles copied over generations. Every scroll represented accumulated knowledge. Every archive preserved decisions affecting millions of lives. If a significant collection disappeared, the consequences would extend far beyond the destruction of paper and silk. Entire chapters of political, cultural, and intellectual history could vanish almost instantly. The simplest explanation follows the destructive nature of urban fire. Once flames reached wooden repositories filled with bamboo slips, silk manuscripts, or paper scrolls, little could be saved. Heat generated by collapsing structures often became intense enough to destroy even materials stored within protective containers. In crowded administrative districts, neighboring buildings frequently ignited one after another, creating chains of destruction difficult to interrupt with the firefighting techniques available at the time. Yet several questions continue to trouble historians. Chinese bureaucratic administration emphasized careful duplication and preservation of important documents. Copies often existed in multiple offices, while officials routinely produced new editions of legal and historical texts. If one archive burned, why do some categories of records appear to disappear almost completely? Why do later historians occasionally refer to earlier documents that no longer survive in any known collection? One possibility lies within the political realities of imperial government. Throughout Chinese history, changes in leadership sometimes resulted in the revision, replacement, or selective preservation of official records. Victorious factions often rewrote political narratives to strengthen legitimacy, emphasizing certain events while minimizing others. If a destructive fire occurred during a period of political transition, distinguishing accidental loss from intentional replacement would become extraordinarily difficult. Some scholars suggest that later generations may have attributed missing documents to fire because it offered a practical explanation for gaps in the historical record. Administrative neglect, warfare, flooding, theft, insect damage, or simple deterioration could gradually reduce archives over decades. Later historians, confronted with incomplete collections, may have associated those losses with a famous urban disaster, even when the actual process unfolded much more slowly. Still, the mystery refuses to disappear. Several surviving texts mention works no longer known to exist. Court historians occasionally cite earlier reports unavailable to modern researchers. Bibliographic catalogs describe manuscripts whose contents have vanished completely. Certain official decisions appear to reference supporting documents that can no longer be located. Together, these absences create the impression of an archive larger and more detailed than anything that has survived into the present. What exactly was lost? Perhaps administrative records describing provinces whose local histories remain poorly understood. Perhaps diplomatic correspondence revealing forgotten relationships with distant kingdoms. Perhaps scientific observations that would illuminate early developments in astronomy, engineering, or medicine. The possibilities are almost limitless precisely because the documents themselves are gone. Archaeology has complicated the picture even further. Excavations within and around the ancient capital have uncovered remarkably preserved inscriptions, official seals, wooden writing tablets, fragments of manuscripts, and everyday administrative objects discarded or buried during different periods of the city's history. Every discovery demonstrates that written material sometimes survives under exceptional conditions, despite centuries of destruction. The famous manuscripts recovered from sites such as Dunhuang have also transformed historical understanding. Hidden inside sealed cave libraries for centuries, these documents preserved religious writings, government papers, contracts, letters, calendars, and literary works once believed lost. Their survival offers a powerful reminder that important collections occasionally escaped disasters that destroyed more visible repositories. Could something similar have occurred in Chang'an? Some researchers believe that private libraries may have preserved copies of documents no longer present within imperial archives. Wealthy families, monasteries, scholars, and regional officials often maintained extensive collections independent of the central government. During moments of crisis, valuable manuscripts might have been removed from the capital altogether, quietly surviving in distant provinces while official repositories disappeared. Others point toward the enormous scale of the city itself. Chang'an covered an immense area, containing countless government compounds, religious institutions, educational centers, and private residences. A fire devastating one district would not necessarily consume every archive within the capital. Could portions of the missing records remain buried beneath collapsed buildings that have never been excavated? Urban archaeology within former imperial capitals remains extraordinarily challenging, and much of ancient Chang'an still lies beneath later occupation. There is also the possibility that the greatest losses occurred not during the fire itself, but afterward. Following major disasters, immediate survival naturally becomes the highest priority. Damaged buildings require demolition. Valuable materials are salvaged. Temporary shelters replace permanent structures. In such confusion, partially burned manuscripts, damaged catalogs, and disorganized archives may receive less attention than restoring the city's essential functions. What survived the flames could later disappear through neglect, weather, or simple misunderstanding of its importance. Regional traditions add another layer to the story. Some later accounts speak of scholars carrying bundles of manuscripts through smoke-filled streets as flames advanced across the capital. Others describe temple libraries opening their doors to protect documents rescued from government offices. While these stories cannot always be verified, they reflect a broader cultural memory that knowledge itself became something worth risking one's life to preserve. More speculative interpretations extend even further. Legends occasionally describe hidden repositories established beneath temples or palace complexes where particularly valuable records were concealed during emergencies. Secret underground chambers appear frequently in folklore associated with ancient capitals, though archaeology has provided little evidence supporting such stories in this case. Even so, the persistence of these traditions reveals an enduring belief that not everything was destroyed. Some historians have wondered whether unidentified manuscript fragments scattered among museum collections worldwide could represent pieces of archives once housed in Chang'an. Over centuries, documents were copied, sold, transported, inherited, and occasionally separated from their original context. A single overlooked scroll might preserve information linking it to collections believed destroyed long ago. Scientific advances continue opening new possibilities. Multispectral imaging has revealed faded writing invisible to the naked eye. Digital reconstruction allows scholars to reconnect manuscript fragments separated for generations. Artificial intelligence assists researchers in comparing handwriting, textual variations, and damaged documents across enormous collections. Every technological advance increases the possibility that forgotten pieces of lost archives may someday be recognized. Yet even these remarkable tools cannot recover documents that no longer exist. Their absence shapes history as profoundly as their presence once did. Entire debates among historians often begin with a single missing source. Why did certain policies change? How extensive was imperial knowledge of distant regions? What discussions unfolded inside the highest levels of government before major political decisions? Sometimes the answer may have existed in records consumed centuries ago. Perhaps that is what makes the mystery of Chang'an's lost records so compelling. It is not simply the disappearance of paper, ink, and bamboo. It is the disappearance of voices. Officials whose reports were never copied again. Scholars whose observations ended in smoke. Clerks who carefully documented ordinary events, never imagining their work might become irreplaceable. Countless moments of daily life, preserved with extraordinary care, may have vanished within hours as flames passed through the world's greatest city. Today, the modern city that occupies the ancient landscape continues to reveal fragments of its remarkable past through ongoing archaeological research. Foundations emerge beneath construction sites. Broken inscriptions appear within forgotten wells. Seals, pottery, coins, and manuscript fragments slowly rebuild portions of a history once thought permanently erased. Yet vast areas remain unexplored, and countless questions remain unanswered. Somewhere beneath layers of earth, inside overlooked collections, or hidden within manuscripts copied centuries after the original archives disappeared, faint echoes of those lost records may still endure. Until new discoveries emerge, the Great Fire of Chang'an remains more than an urban disaster. It stands as a reminder that history is shaped not only by the events we remember, but also by the knowledge that vanished before anyone realized how deeply it would one day be missed. If the lost records of Chang'an remind us that knowledge can disappear in a single night of flames, our next mystery explores a different kind of silence. This is not the silence left behind by burned manuscripts or abandoned cities, but by individuals who deliberately stepped away from the world. They sought isolation instead of recognition, solitude instead of remembrance. In doing so, they left behind almost nothing except faint traditions and unanswered questions that still echo across one of Europe's most secluded landscapes. Long before the first rays of sunlight reach the sea, Mount Athos rises from the northern Aegean like a shadow carved from stone. Its steep cliffs plunge into dark waters, while dense forests blanket the lower slopes in chestnut, oak, pine, and cypress. Narrow ravines disappear beneath thick vegetation, and hidden springs emerge from limestone before flowing quietly toward the coast. Above everything stands the mountain itself, its summit reaching more than 2,000 meters into shifting clouds that often conceal its highest peak from those below. From a distance, the peninsula appears almost untouched. The sea surrounds it on three sides, forming a natural barrier that has preserved its isolation for centuries. Small coves provide only limited landing places, while the rugged interior discourages easy travel. Even today, much of the landscape remains remarkably difficult to reach, requiring long walks along winding paths that follow ancient routes through forests and rocky slopes. To countless visitors throughout history, Mount Athos has represented withdrawal from ordinary life. Today, it is known throughout the world as one of the most important centers of Eastern Orthodox monasticism, home to monasteries whose traditions extend back more than 1,000 years. Libraries preserve priceless manuscripts, chapels contain centuries-old frescoes, and communities continue practices established during the Byzantine period. Yet before the great monasteries appeared, there is silence. The organized monastic communities associated with Mount Athos largely emerged during the 9th and 10th centuries AD, particularly after imperial patronage encouraged permanent religious foundations. Historical records from this later period become increasingly detailed, documenting abbots, monasteries, donations, land grants, and religious life with impressive precision. But earlier centuries remain remarkably obscure. Scattered references suggest that solitary ascetics occupied the peninsula long before organized monasteries transformed it into a spiritual center. These individuals, often described simply as hermits or anchorites, appear briefly within religious writings before disappearing once again into uncertainty. Who were they? How many lived there? And perhaps most intriguingly, what became of them? The historical background offers several clues. Throughout the early centuries of Christianity, ascetic life spread across the eastern Mediterranean. Inspired by figures such as the Desert Fathers of Egypt, many believers abandoned cities to pursue lives of prayer in caves, mountains, forests, and remote wilderness. Isolation was not viewed as loneliness, but as a spiritual discipline, allowing uninterrupted contemplation far from political conflict and worldly distraction. Mount Athos would have offered an ideal refuge. Its steep terrain, natural caves, reliable freshwater sources, and geographic isolation created conditions favorable for solitary existence. Small groups, or even individuals living entirely alone, could survive with little contact beyond occasional fishermen or passing sailors. Several Byzantine sources allude to ascetics already inhabiting the peninsula before the establishment of formal monasteries. Yet these references rarely provide names, locations, or detailed descriptions. Instead, they offer brief glimpses of an already ancient tradition. One text mentions holy men living in remote places. Another refers to solitary worshippers encountered by later monks. Elsewhere, religious traditions speak of hermits who occupied caves high above the sea, devoting decades to silence and prayer before quietly disappearing from memory. The simplest explanation is also the most practical. Early hermits rarely intended to leave historical records. Unlike royal courts or established monasteries, solitary ascetics produced few documents. Many possessed only essential belongings, lived in temporary shelters, and deliberately avoided public recognition. Their success depended upon remaining unnoticed rather than becoming famous. If one died alone within an isolated cave, there might be no witness to record the event. Over time, nature itself would reclaim the site. Wooden shelters would decay. Stone paths would disappear beneath vegetation. Small gardens would return to forest. Within only a few generations, almost every physical trace of a solitary dwelling could vanish beneath the changing landscape. This explanation aligns closely with archaeological reality. Mountain environments continuously reshape themselves through erosion, landslides, vegetation growth, and seasonal weather. Tiny hermitages constructed from local materials often leave little evidence recognizable after many centuries. Even modern archaeological surveys can overlook small occupation sites hidden among dense woodland or inaccessible cliffs. Yet several mysteries remain. Certain medieval traditions describe groups of hermits rather than isolated individuals. These communities appear to have shared broad spiritual ideals while maintaining physical separation from one another. Pilgrims occasionally referred to scattered ascetics living within walking distance, yet meeting only rarely. Then the references simply stop. When larger monasteries became established, the earlier inhabitants largely disappeared from historical attention. Did they willingly join the new religious communities? Did they relocate deeper into the mountains? Or had their numbers already begun declining long before organized monastic life transformed the peninsula? One possibility reflects changing religious organization. As monasteries developed stable food supplies, libraries, workshops, and communal worship, many solitary ascetics may have embraced this evolving form of spiritual life. Historical transitions often appear more abrupt within written records than they truly were. Rather than disappearing, the hermits may simply have become monks within institutions whose archives preserved only their new identities. Another explanation centers upon demographics. Extreme solitude demands extraordinary endurance. Illness, accidents, advancing age, and limited resources would naturally reduce isolated populations over time. Without continuous arrival of new hermits, small communities could gradually disappear through ordinary mortality alone. Political circumstances also deserve consideration. Between late antiquity and the early medieval period, the Byzantine world experienced repeated instability. Slavic migrations affected parts of the Balkans. Arab naval activity altered security throughout the eastern Mediterranean. Piracy occasionally threatened isolated coastal settlements. Although Mount Athos remained geographically protected, changing regional conditions may have interrupted travel, supplies, and communication with the outside world. Even modest disruptions could profoundly affect individuals living at the edge of survival. Still, Mount Athos continues to inspire more unusual interpretations. Among long-standing monastic traditions are stories describing mysterious ascetics encountered unexpectedly by travelers before disappearing into forests or rocky valleys. Some accounts tell of elderly hermits who refused to reveal their names, offering only brief conversations before quietly continuing deeper into the wilderness. Others describe remote chapels discovered accidentally, only for later visitors to struggle finding them again. Such stories belong primarily to religious tradition rather than verifiable history. Yet they reflect a recurring theme. The mountain itself seems to conceal those who seek complete solitude. Local geography encourages this impression. The peninsula contains hundreds of caves, hidden ravines, elevated plateaus, and forested slopes difficult to explore systematically. Even today, experienced residents know paths unfamiliar to most visitors. Small shelters built within natural rock formations can remain almost invisible unless approached from precisely the right direction. Modern technology has improved archaeological exploration considerably. Satellite imagery, drone surveys, digital terrain modeling, and LiDAR scanning have transformed research in mountainous environments worldwide. These methods occasionally reveal terraces, pathways, and stone structures hidden beneath dense vegetation. Could similar techniques eventually identify forgotten hermitages dating to Mount Athos's earliest Christian inhabitants? Researchers remain cautiously optimistic. Several isolated chapels and ancient cells discovered during recent decades demonstrate that important sites continue emerging unexpectedly. Some appear older than previously believed, suggesting that religious occupation may indeed extend further into the past than surviving documents indicate. Yet archaeology faces important limitations. Finding a ruined shelter does not necessarily identify its occupant. A small cave modified for habitation may reveal evidence of human presence without revealing names, beliefs, or individual histories. The deepest mystery often remains beyond excavation. Other scholars focus upon manuscripts rather than landscapes. Mount Athos preserves one of the richest collections of Byzantine documents anywhere in the world. Thousands of manuscripts remain under careful preservation within monastic libraries. Many have never been fully studied. Occasionally, overlooked marginal notes, copied traditions, or forgotten references emerge during scholarly examination, illuminating aspects of medieval religious life previously unknown. Could one of these manuscripts preserve forgotten memories of the earliest hermits? The possibility remains entirely plausible. Throughout history, seemingly insignificant notes copied by anonymous scribes have transformed understanding of entire historical periods. More speculative ideas move beyond conventional historical interpretation. Some traditions suggest that certain hermits intentionally concealed themselves from both society and fellow ascetics, believing absolute anonymity represented the highest expression of humility. According to these accounts, spiritual accomplishment required complete disappearance from worldly recognition. If such individuals truly existed, they would have succeeded beyond imagination. History itself would have forgotten them. Others wonder whether early hermits encountered remnants of even older occupations scattered across the peninsula. Mount Athos had witnessed human activity long before Christianity reached the region. Ancient pathways, abandoned shrines, seasonal settlements, and forgotten lookout points may all have lingered within the landscape, creating layers of memory that later generations interpreted through new spiritual traditions. Natural phenomena may also have contributed to enduring legends. Mountain weather changes rapidly. Dense fog can reduce visibility within minutes. Echoes travel unpredictably through steep valleys. Light reflected from the sea produces unusual optical effects at sunrise and sunset. For solitary individuals spending decades within such surroundings, ordinary environmental experiences could acquire profound symbolic meaning. Later visitors hearing these accounts may have interpreted them as evidence of extraordinary events, rather than descriptions of an already remarkable landscape. Perhaps the most compelling aspect of this mystery is not the disappearance itself, but the intention behind it. Unlike lost armies, missing fleets, or abandoned cities, these hermits actively pursued obscurity. They measured success not through influence, wealth, or recognition, but through withdrawal from all three. Their goal was silence. Their legacy became silence as well. Today, Mount Athos remains one of the world's most secluded religious landscapes. Ancient footpaths still wind beneath towering forests. Waves continue breaking against cliffs, much as they did more than 1,000 years ago. Bells echo from monasteries whose foundations rest upon centuries of uninterrupted tradition, while beyond their walls, countless caves, terraces, and hidden valleys remain largely unexplored. Somewhere among those quiet slopes, beneath fallen leaves, behind weathered stone walls, or inside forgotten caverns where sunlight rarely reaches, traces of the earliest hermits may still survive. Perhaps a carved cross hidden within a cliff, fragments of pottery beside an overlooked spring, or a faded manuscript resting quietly upon a library shelf will someday reveal another piece of their story. Until then, the missing hermits of Mount Athos remain suspended between documented history, sacred tradition, and the enduring silence of a mountain that has always seemed willing to guard the secrets entrusted to it. If the hidden hermitages of Mount Athos remind us that silence can preserve secrets for centuries, the next mystery carries that silence into the heart of Central Europe. This time, the unanswered questions are not hidden inside mountain caves or forgotten manuscripts, but within the remains of a fortress that appears to have been left behind with surprising order. Its walls still overlook the surrounding landscape, yet those who once defended them seem to have slipped away without leaving a clear explanation. Morning mist drifts slowly across the broad floodplains of the Tisa River, where reeds sway gently along quiet backwaters and clusters of willow trees cast long reflections over calm water. Beyond the wetlands, low hills emerge from the horizon, their outlines softened by layers of pale fog. The landscape appears peaceful, almost timeless, but beneath the fields and riverbanks lie traces of settlements that witnessed centuries of migration, warfare, and political transformation. Every generation left something behind, while every river flood quietly reshaped the land that followed. Near the modern settlement of Tisaluk in eastern Hungary, archaeologists have identified the remains of fortified sites that once occupied an important position along regional routes connecting the Great Hungarian Plain with territories farther north and east. Throughout the early medieval period, this frontier experienced repeated movements of peoples, shifting alliances and changing centers of authority. Rivers served not only as natural barriers, but also as highways carrying traders, soldiers, and travelers across remarkable distances. Within this landscape stands one of its quieter historical puzzles. Excavated earthworks and defensive features suggest the existence of a substantial fortified settlement. Timber palisades once surrounded elevated ground, while ditches and embankments provided additional protection. Judging by its location, the fortress appears to have controlled access to nearby river crossings and valuable agricultural land. It was not an isolated refuge hidden deep within wilderness, but a carefully chosen position where defense and communication could be maintained simultaneously. Yet when archaeologists began piecing together the story of the site, something unusual emerged. Evidence suggested occupation. Evidence suggested planning. Evidence suggested organization. But the final chapter appeared strangely incomplete. Rather than displaying unmistakable signs of violent destruction, widespread burning, or hurried collapse, parts of the site seemed to indicate a comparatively orderly abandonment. Defensive structures deteriorated over time, buildings disappeared, and daily activity ceased. Yet the archaeological record offered remarkably little indication of a catastrophic event, explaining why the fortress no longer served its original purpose. The simplest explanation reflects broader historical developments throughout the Carpathian Basin. The early medieval centuries witnessed constant political change. Tribal confederations evolved into kingdoms, frontier systems shifted, and strategic priorities changed alongside new centers of power. A fortress considered essential during one generation might become unnecessary during the next if trade routes moved, administrative boundaries changed, or nearby settlements expanded. Under such circumstances, abandonment would not necessarily represent disaster. It could simply reflect adaptation. Communities often relocated toward more favorable farmland, stronger regional centers, or newly established political capitals. Timber buildings were dismantled, useful materials reused elsewhere, and former defensive sites gradually surrendered to nature. Even so, several details continue to encourage closer examination. Fortresses generally represented considerable investments of labor. Constructing earthworks, Cutting timber, transporting materials, and maintaining defensive systems required sustained communal effort. Such places rarely lost their importance overnight without compelling reasons. If Tisaluk's fortress truly occupied a strategic location, why does its final occupation appear to end so quietly? One possibility centers upon environmental change. The Tisa River has altered its course repeatedly throughout history. Flooding, erosion, sediment deposition, and shifting wetlands have transformed large portions of the surrounding landscape. A river crossing essential during one century could become unreliable during the next. Agricultural fields might gradually become marshland, while transportation routes adjusted to changing geography. If environmental conditions slowly reduced the fortress's strategic value, relocation may have become the most practical decision. Another explanation involves economics rather than warfare. As regional commerce evolved, settlements competing for trade often rose or declined according to changing networks of exchange. Markets shifted toward emerging towns, while smaller fortified communities lost both population and influence. Without sufficient economic activity, maintaining permanent defenses became increasingly difficult. Political consolidation also deserves consideration. As stronger kingdoms emerged across Central Europe, authority became concentrated within larger administrative centers. Small frontier fortifications sometimes lost their military role as centralized governments developed more organized defensive systems. Garrisons relocated. Officials departed. Local leaders established new residences elsewhere. The fortress would remain. Its purpose would not. Archaeological evidence from comparable sites across the region supports this gradual pattern of transition. Numerous early medieval fortifications display phases of expansion followed by orderly decline rather than dramatic destruction. History often changes quietly, without battles worthy of chroniclers. Yet the silence surrounding Tisaluk continues to invite deeper reflection. Excavations have revealed everyday objects connected with ordinary life: pottery fragments, tools, food remains, and evidence of domestic activity. Such discoveries remind researchers that the fortress was more than a military installation. Families likely lived within its defenses. Children grew up beside its walls. Craftsmen repaired equipment. Farmers stored harvests, and local leaders governed surrounding communities. Where did they all go? The archaeological record rarely answers questions of identity. Objects remain. People disappear. Some historians suggest that the fortress's inhabitants simply merged into neighboring settlements, carrying their traditions without preserving written accounts of their migration. In societies where literacy remained limited, entire communities could relocate while leaving almost no documentary evidence behind. Others point toward the incomplete nature of archaeological investigation itself. Only portions of many early medieval sites have been excavated. Significant areas often remain untouched beneath farmland, modern construction, or natural deposits. Future discoveries could reveal later occupation phases, evidence of conflict, or administrative buildings capable of reshaping current interpretations. Technology continues improving that possibility. Ground-penetrating radar, magnetometry, aerial photography, and LiDAR surveys increasingly identify buried structures invisible from the surface. Subtle soil discolorations reveal vanished buildings. Ancient roads emerge beneath cultivated fields. Defensive systems once thought incomplete become visible through digital landscape analysis. Every advancement reminds researchers that apparent mysteries sometimes reflect incomplete evidence rather than permanent absence. Yet not every question disappears so easily. Regional folklore occasionally preserves stories of abandoned strongholds whose inhabitants departed before sunrise, leaving behind empty buildings but taking nearly everything of value with them. Other tales speak of settlements gradually reclaimed by marshes as changing rivers swallowed roads and fields alike. Such traditions cannot be accepted as historical proof, but they often preserve echoes of genuine environmental changes experienced across generations. More speculative theories have occasionally emerged as well. Some propose that the fortress served temporary political purposes during a period of regional instability, functioning as a seasonal administrative center rather than a permanently occupied stronghold. Once those circumstances changed, continued occupation became unnecessary. Others wonder whether epidemic disease could explain the gradual disappearance. Unlike dramatic warfare, outbreaks sometimes encouraged survivors to relocate while avoiding prolonged contact with abandoned settlements. Medieval communities rarely understood the biological causes of disease, yet they often responded by leaving affected locations behind. There is little direct evidence supporting this idea at Tisaluk, but it remains among several possibilities considered when conventional explanations leave important questions unanswered. Still others focus upon the remarkable flexibility of frontier societies. Communities living along political borders frequently adapted with extraordinary speed. Alliances shifted. Trade partners changed. Defensive needs evolved. Rather than viewing abandonment as failure, perhaps it reflected resilience, the willingness to recognize when survival required movement rather than permanence. Modern archaeology has transformed understanding of the Tisa region during recent decades. Excavations continue revealing forgotten settlements, burial grounds, workshops, and agricultural systems that illustrate the complexity of life across the early medieval plain. Environmental studies reconstruct ancient river channels with increasing accuracy, while advances in dating techniques refine occupation sequences once considered uncertain. Each new discovery fills another small gap. Yet the fortress itself continues withholding its final explanation. Its embankments still mark the landscape. Its ditches still trace forgotten boundaries. Beneath layers of grass and soil remain fragments of walls built by hands whose names have long since vanished. The silence surrounding the site does not suggest dramatic catastrophe. Instead, it speaks of something quieter, an ending so gradual that history itself struggled to notice when it occurred. Perhaps that is why the mystery endures. Not every unanswered question is born from violence or sudden disappearance. Sometimes an entire community simply steps away from the place it once called home, leaving behind only weathered earthworks and scattered artifacts to hint that life once flourished there. Whether future excavations uncover forgotten documents, additional structures, or evidence that transforms current understanding, the empty fortress at Tisaluk continues to watch over the slow waters of the Tisa, quietly guarding a story that has not yet revealed its final page. The mystery grows even deeper when the fortress is viewed not as a single structure, but as part of a much larger frontier stretching across the Carpathian basin. During the early medieval centuries, this region stood at the meeting point of cultures, languages, and competing political powers. Travelers moving along the rivers might encounter Slavic communities, Magyar groups, Avar remnants, merchants from distant lands, and emissaries carrying messages between rulers. Every generation reshaped the landscape, yet every generation also inherited the unfinished stories of those who had come before. The fortress at Tisaluk almost certainly did not exist in complete isolation. Similar fortified settlements appeared throughout the region, each connected by rivers, trade routes, and systems of communication that allowed warnings to travel surprisingly quickly. A signal fire lit on one hill might be answered by another many kilometers away. Riders could carry news along riverbanks faster than dense forests allowed elsewhere in Europe. In such a network, the abandonment of one fortress may have affected many others. Did neighboring settlements notice when its gates no longer opened? Did merchants arriving with goods find the watchtowers unmanned? Or did the transition occur so gradually that no single moment marked the end? These questions remain difficult to answer because the archaeological evidence preserves only fragments of daily life. Pottery can reveal what people ate. Animal bones hint at livestock and hunting. Charcoal layers may indicate hearths or occasional fires. Yet none of these discoveries can explain the emotions experienced by those preparing to leave a home that had protected their families for decades. Imagine the final weeks of occupation. The wooden walls still stand firm. Smoke continues rising from cooking fires each evening. Livestock graze beyond the defensive ditch, while children follow familiar paths between houses built by their parents and grandparents. Nothing appears dramatically different. Yet conversations begin to change. Perhaps the nearby river has become less reliable. Perhaps traders no longer arrive as frequently. Perhaps a regional lord has ordered the community to relocate closer to a new administrative center. Such decisions rarely happen overnight. Families would gather belongings carefully rather than hastily. Valuable tools would be packed. Iron fittings removed from buildings could be reused elsewhere. Doors, beams, and roofing timbers represented precious resources, far too valuable to abandon without reason. This deliberate dismantling could explain why archaeologists sometimes discover surprisingly few complete objects within deserted settlements. The fortress itself may have been emptied piece by piece. Long before the final family departed, sections of its defenses might already have been neglected. Wooden palisades require constant maintenance. Rain weakens exposed timber. Frost widens small cracks. Earth embankments slowly erode unless repaired. Once regular maintenance ceased, nature would begin reclaiming the site almost immediately. Within a generation, grass would soften the outlines of defensive ditches. Shrubs would spread across abandoned courtyards. Trees would eventually root where buildings once stood. From a distance, the fortress would no longer appear occupied, even though its earthworks remained visible against the surrounding plain. Environmental studies conducted throughout the Tisa region demonstrate just how dynamic this landscape has always been. Before modern river regulation projects, seasonal floods transformed enormous areas every year. Channels shifted unpredictably, creating new islands while abandoning old ones. Wetlands expanded and contracted with changing climates. A settlement positioned beside an ideal river crossing in one century could find itself isolated from major routes only decades later. This constantly changing environment may hold one of the strongest clues to the fortress's fate. Recent geological research has shown that many ancient settlements across Central Europe were forced to adapt repeatedly to environmental pressures. Communities did not necessarily collapse because of warfare. Sometimes they simply followed the water. As rivers moved, people moved with them. Another fascinating possibility involves the changing character of military defense itself. Early frontier fortifications often relied upon local militias rather than permanent professional soldiers. Farmers became defenders when danger approached, then returned to agriculture during peaceful seasons. If regional stability improved, maintaining a large fortified enclosure may have become increasingly unnecessary. Defensive responsibilities could shift toward castles, royal centers, or stone strongholds better suited to evolving political structures. In that case, Tisaluk's fortress would not have failed. It would simply have completed its purpose. Archaeologists have also noted that many early medieval settlements contain evidence of continuity hidden beneath apparent abandonment. A fortified enclosure might fall out of use while nearby villages continued thriving. People remained in the region even as the symbolic center of authority moved elsewhere. Future excavations around Tisaluk may yet reveal farmsteads, workshops, cemeteries, or chapels connected to descendants of those who once lived inside the fortress walls. Folklore offers another intriguing layer. Throughout eastern Hungary, stories have long circulated about ancient earthen rings and forgotten strongholds hidden beneath fields. Some tales describe mysterious lights drifting above old embankments during autumn evenings. Others speak of phantom guards watching over places where no walls remain standing. Such legends belong to oral tradition rather than documented history, yet they demonstrate how unusual landscapes often preserve memories long after factual details have faded. Interestingly, many of these stories do not describe violent endings. Instead, they tell of communities quietly disappearing, leaving the land itself to remember what people no longer could. Modern researchers continue returning to sites like Tzolk'in because every excavation raises new questions alongside new discoveries. Improved dating techniques refine occupation phases with greater precision. Soil analysis identifies traces of crops cultivated centuries ago. Microscopic pollen preserved beneath the ground reconstructs ancient forests, grasslands, and wetlands, allowing historians to understand not only how people lived, but also how the surrounding environment changed throughout generations. Each scientific advance narrows the range of possibilities, yet certainty remains elusive. Perhaps somewhere beyond the excavated boundaries lies the missing piece. A forgotten cemetery identifying the final inhabitants, an overlooked workshop indicating later occupation, or a buried roadway revealing where the departing community ultimately traveled. History often rewards patience, and some of archaeology's greatest discoveries have emerged from places once believed fully understood. Until that day arrives, the empty fortress at Tzolk'in remains a quiet reminder that disappearance does not always require catastrophe. Sometimes history slips away gradually, almost unnoticed, as families seek new opportunities, rivers reshape familiar landscapes, and once vital strongholds slowly surrender to grass, wind, and time. The earth remembers their presence even when written records do not, leaving us to wonder whether the next excavation will finally reveal why one carefully built fortress fell silent while the world around it continued to change. The morning mist settles heavily across the rolling countryside of early medieval England. Low hills disappear beneath drifting clouds, while narrow paths wind through fields broken only by ancient churches and weathered stone crosses. In the distance, the bells of a monastery echo across the landscape, their sound carrying through damp forests and quiet villages. Here, in a world where faith shaped every aspect of daily life, bishops were not simply spiritual leaders. They were diplomats, advisors to kings, guardians of knowledge, and powerful political figures whose influence extended far beyond the walls of their churches. It is within this landscape that the story of Bishop Aelstán unfolds, a man whose life is reasonably well documented, yet whose death remains strangely uncertain. Despite his importance in one of the most influential kingdoms of Anglo-Saxon England, the final chapter of his life has never been fully explained. Centuries have passed since chroniclers first recorded his name, yet historians continue to debate exactly how his remarkable career came to an end. Who was Bishop Aelstán? Did he simply die of natural causes after decades of service? Or did his death occur amid political struggles that later writers deliberately concealed? The surviving evidence is remarkably thin, and what little remains leaves room for questions that have never entirely disappeared. Aelstán served as Bishop of Sherborne during the 9th century, a turbulent period marked by shifting alliances, Viking raids, and the growing struggle for dominance among the kingdoms of Anglo-Saxon England. Sherborne itself was one of the kingdom's most important ecclesiastical centers. Its cathedral stood not merely as a place of worship, but as a center of administration, education, and royal influence. From here, bishops managed extensive lands, advised monarchs, and played significant roles in military and political affairs. Unlike the modern image of a bishop devoted exclusively to religious matters, church leaders during this period often occupied positions that blurred the line between sacred and secular authority. Surviving charters show Aelstán witnessing royal documents, participating in councils, and maintaining close relationships with King Ethelwulf of Wessex and, later, his successors. These records portray a figure deeply embedded in the political machinery of his age. One particularly intriguing aspect of Eilstan's career comes from references suggesting that he may even have commanded military forces. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and later medieval sources imply that he participated in campaigns against Viking raiders during the mid-9th century. If accurate, this would make him one of several high-ranking churchmen whose responsibilities extended beyond the altar and into the battlefield. Such accounts can seem surprising today. Yet in 9th century England, the survival of kingdoms often depended upon every major leader contributing to defense. Monasteries were frequent targets of Viking attacks, prized for their accumulated wealth and relatively weak fortifications. Bishops, responsible for protecting both their communities and valuable church lands, sometimes found themselves drawn into conflicts that tested not only their faith, but their leadership. Throughout his long episcopate, Eilstan appears repeatedly within official records. Charters bearing his name survive in considerable numbers, suggesting decades of influence and consistent royal favor. Unlike many figures from the period who emerge briefly before fading into obscurity, Eilstan remained visible across multiple reigns. Then, almost without warning, the records become uncertain. Most historians place his death sometime around 867, though even this date is not universally accepted. Different manuscripts present subtle inconsistencies. Some later chroniclers offer only brief notices. Others remain completely silent. No contemporary account describes the circumstances surrounding his final days. No surviving letter records an illness. No detailed obituary praises his accomplishments. For someone who occupied such an important position for so many years, the absence of information feels unexpectedly striking. This silence forms the heart of the mystery. In many cases involving early medieval figures, missing information is hardly unusual. Countless documents have simply been lost to war, fire, decay, or centuries of neglect. Parchment was expensive, and libraries often suffered destruction during invasions or political upheaval. Entire archives disappeared without leaving copies behind. Could Eilstan's missing story simply be another casualty of history? That remains the explanation favored by many scholars. According to this view, there is no hidden conspiracy, no secret assassination, and no carefully erased scandal. Instead, the surviving evidence represents only a tiny fraction of what once existed. If detailed accounts of his death were ever written, they may simply have failed to survive the passage of more than 11 centuries. Yet not everyone finds this explanation completely satisfying. One reason is the extraordinary political climate surrounding the final years of Eilstan's life. The late 860s witnessed profound instability across England. Viking armies had grown larger, more organized, and increasingly ambitious. Rather than conducting brief seasonal raids, some forces began establishing long-term campaigns that threatened entire kingdoms. Within Wessex itself, royal succession remained a sensitive matter. Power shifted among members of the royal family, while regional leaders navigated constantly changing alliances. Bishops often served as trusted advisors, precisely because they occupied positions that connected both church and crown. If disagreements emerged behind closed doors, they rarely remained purely religious. Some historians have noted that Eilstan's long career placed him at the center of multiple royal transitions. He witnessed generations of political change. Such longevity inevitably raises questions. Did he remain equally trusted throughout his life? Did shifting factions within the kingdom alter his position? Or did his influence eventually become controversial? Unfortunately, surviving evidence provides no definitive answers. This uncertainty has encouraged more speculative interpretations. One theory suggests that Eilstan may have died during a period of political conflict, whose details were deliberately minimized by later chroniclers, seeking to preserve institutional stability. Medieval writers often shaped historical narratives according to moral, religious, or political priorities. Certain events received elaborate treatment, while others were summarized in only a few words, or omitted altogether. If Elstan became involved in a dispute between rival claimants, influential nobles, or competing church interests, would every chronicler have chosen to preserve those uncomfortable details? There is no direct evidence proving such a scenario. Still, historians acknowledge that medieval records must always be read carefully, considering not only what they include, but also what they leave unsaid. Another possibility centers upon the Viking threat itself. The 9th century brought repeated attacks across southern England. Monasteries, churches, and episcopal centers often lay directly in the path of invading forces. Although no surviving source explicitly states that Elstan died during one of these conflicts, some researchers have wondered whether military activity disrupted record-keeping or even contributed indirectly to his disappearance from history. Imagine the uncertainty of those years. News traveled slowly. Entire communities relocated to escape advancing armies. Monastic scriptoria, the very places responsible for preserving written history, could be abandoned or destroyed. In such circumstances, even the death of a prominent bishop might pass into the historical record with surprising brevity. Yet another layer of mystery emerges when examining later medieval traditions. Over the centuries, stories surrounding important religious figures frequently evolved. Saints accumulated miracles. Bishops gained legendary reputations. Local traditions sometimes preserved details that never appeared in official chronicles. Curiously, however, Elstan never developed the rich body of folklore that surrounded many comparable church leaders. His legacy remained unusually restrained. He appears in documents as an administrator, advisor, and occasionally a military participant, but rarely as the central figure in dramatic legends. Some researchers interpret this absence as further evidence that much of his story simply disappeared. Others wonder whether later generations intentionally emphasized institutional continuity over personal drama, allowing individual controversies to fade quietly from collective memory. The surviving charters themselves contribute another subtle puzzle. Historians carefully analyze witness lists attached to royal grants because they reveal networks of influence. The order in which names appear often reflects status within the royal court. Elstan's presence across numerous documents demonstrates remarkable consistency over decades. Then those appearances stop. From a modern perspective, such an ending can feel abrupt. We naturally expect biographies to conclude with detailed accounts of retirement, illness, or funeral ceremonies. Early medieval documentation rarely offers such comforts. Instead, people often vanish from written history between one surviving document and the next. Still, when that disappearance involves someone who stood so close to kings during one of England's most transformative centuries, curiosity naturally follows. Could additional manuscripts still exist somewhere, overlooked in forgotten collections? Every so often, historians discover previously unknown medieval texts hidden inside later book bindings, private archives, or monastery collections. Modern imaging technology has even revealed erased writing beneath reused parchment, recovering words that had remained invisible for hundreds of years. These discoveries remind us that history is never entirely finished. Archives continue yielding unexpected fragments capable of reshaping accepted narratives. If a lost chronicle describing Elstan's final days were discovered tomorrow, it might settle debates that have continued for generations. Or it might introduce entirely new questions. Beyond mainstream historical discussion lies a collection of more speculative interpretations that occasionally appear in books, documentaries, and historical forums. Some suggest Elstan possessed knowledge of sensitive political negotiations involving the royal family, and that his death coincided suspiciously with changing balances of power. Others propose that conflicts within the church itself may have played a role, arguing that ecclesiastical disagreements during this period were sometimes more intense than surviving records suggest. A few fringe theories go even further, proposing deliberate suppression of documents by later religious authorities seeking to present a simplified version of events. According to these ideas, inconvenient episodes involving influential bishops may have been quietly omitted during the copying of manuscripts over subsequent centuries. Professional historians generally regard these proposals with caution. While manuscript loss and selective recording unquestionably occurred, direct evidence supporting deliberate concealment in Aelstan's specific case remains absent. Nevertheless, the very possibility illustrates how historical silence often encourages imaginative interpretation. Perhaps the greatest lesson offered by this mystery is not about conspiracy or hidden secrets, but about the fragile nature of historical memory itself. Entire lives can become compressed into a handful of surviving documents. Powerful individuals who once advised kings, directed churches, and influenced national events may ultimately be remembered through little more than scattered signatures on fading parchment. Aelstan undoubtedly lived in a world filled with conversations, ambitions, loyalties, fears, and decisions that shaped the course of his kingdom. Yet almost all of those moments have vanished forever. Standing today among the ancient stones of Sherborne, where centuries of worship have continued long after Aelstan's lifetime, it becomes remarkably easy to imagine how much has disappeared beyond recovery. Wind moves through the old churchyards. Bells continue to ring across the Dorset landscape much as they did more than 1,000 years ago. Beneath those familiar sounds lies a silence that no surviving chronicle fully explains. Was Bishop Aelstan's death simply one more ordinary event whose details were lost through time? Did political realities shape the records that reached us? Or does the absence itself point toward a story that medieval history has yet to reveal? For now, the evidence remains incomplete, the questions remain open, and somewhere within the gaps left by history, the final days of one of Anglo-Saxon England's most influential bishops continue to wait in silence.